Microsoft and Meta platforms. We're on-demand news 24 hours a day. Subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew.
All right, Amy, thank you. In the teeth of earnings reporting season, thanks for being part of our broadcast today. Welcome to the Wednesday edition, even though I'm pretty sure I said yesterday was Wednesday. That's kind of where we are. It's just a big blur right now. Wednesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News Live because you'll actually see Brad Howard with us in studio as we save a seat for you every day here in Washington, following the candidates after quite a night on the trail. How outraged are you today, I guess, is the question, because there seems to be a lot of anger around this day after Kamala Harris delivered the big speech from the ellipse. Joe Biden sitting about 1,000 feet behind her saying something that did not go over very well with Republicans. If you haven't heard about the whole garbage episode yet, let's walk you through it. Here's the president talking last night.
And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
Okay. So this becomes a story, apparently, of the almighty apostrophe. The White House released a transcript showing that Mr. Biden was saying his supporters, apostrophe, possessive demonization, meaning that this comedian who was at Madison Square Garden, he was talking about with the Puerto Rico floating island of garbage reference, was the demonization that he was referring to. Trump camp doesn't buy it. This thing has exploded to the point where Joe Biden had to come out with a clarifying statement. And now an interesting moment for Kamala Harris. Everybody woke up this morning asking, will she separate herself from the president? Here's reaction from the vice president on her way out of town earlier today.
First of all, he clarified his comments, but let me be clear. I strongly disagree with any criticism of people based on who they vote for. You heard my speech last night and continuously throughout my career. I believe that the work that I do is about representing all the people, whether they support me or not. And as President of the United States, I will be a president for all Americans, whether you vote for me or not.
So is that? Are we going to spend as much time talking about this as we did the rhetoric at Madison Square Garden? Is there an equivalency? Hashtag deplorables. Brad is with us right now, made his way over from Corcoran Street Group. It's good to see you, sir. Thanks for coming back. You remember deplorables. Yeah. That was a moment that Hillary Clinton, I'm sure, regrets. But it does seem that speak to the outrage. It seems that we're in a world where both parties are just waiting around all day, waiting for something like this to happen so they can kick out fundraising emails and start freaking out about the rhetoric here. Where are you with what Joe Biden said?
Are you suggesting people feign offense around election time to raise money?
Sure.
No, I mean, look, there's a lot of differences here between that and the basket of deplorables comment. First being, he is not the candidate. We made a change a few months ago for that. I don't know if you heard. So he's not the candidate anymore. She is. And I think it gives her an opportunity to, one, she's consistently said it. If you remember, there was an interview where Fox News tried to get her to insult Trump's base and voters. And she said, I'm not going to do that, Brett. It was with Brett Baer. And she said, I'm not going to call the American people a name. And today, she said the exact same thing, even after Joe Biden did it, our Democratic president. And so that right there shows me that she's willing to stand up for what she believes in, even if it's against her own party. Yeah. That's a pretty powerful piece of character to get to show, days before an election.
Did she just remove herself from Joe Biden? Is this why Joe Biden wasn't invited last night?
Well, I mean, I think Joe Biden, he was there last night, but obviously not at the rally. But yeah, this election's about her and her vision. I mean, in a few days we're gonna watch Joe Biden fly off in a helicopter. And I think he was one of our greatest presidents, particularly in terms of defending democracy here at home and abroad. I think he'll go down in the record books for that work he did that was so pivotal to protecting our democracy. But this election is about her vision for the future, and what she's going to do for the American people. When she talks about a new way forward, it's actually kind of a genius slogan, I think, because when you talk about new way versus old way, who's the old way? Donald Trump, Joe Biden. Where are we going? Not backward, forward. So a new way forward separates her from Trump and Biden and presents a contrast, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, we talked last evening on the late edition of Balance of Power about what was said at Madison Square Garden, the outrage, and some of the lasting, we really can't quantify impact that this might have on young Latino voters, on Puerto Rican voters, who both campaigns are struggling to reach now. Is there an equivalency here?
No, not at all, because two things. Number one, take it aside that it's not appropriate for anybody to refer to anybody as trash or garbage.
Yeah.
Number two, I think what President Biden did say about President Trump's supporters, they are already fired up. They are not going to get fired up anymore. I don't know if there's a Trump supporter that isn't going to come hell or high water, go vote. The Puerto Rican community is ideologically incohesive. Like they range the political spectrum. They probably lean more Democratic once they come over to the States on the island of Puerto Rico, which it's an American territory. So people that are born there are American citizens.
Yeah.
But the parties are differentiated around the question of statehood. It's not like the parties are differentiated here. When they come over here, they lean Democratic, but they're still gettable. They're still persuadable. And in key districts, including in the Pennsylvania, there's a huge swath of them. So Donald Trump probably hurt himself with a key constituency of swing voters. I don't know that Joe Biden's comment last night offended. I mean, it may have offended, but it's not going to change any persuadable voters' minds in this upcoming election.
Anyone who would associate themselves, I think, with Donald Trump, insulted by that remark, would never vote for Joe Biden anyway, right?
Correct.
So not a needle mover.
And again, it wasn't the candidate. If Kamala had said that, we'd be having a very different conversation.
Understood. So I like talking with you because you're a practitioner. There are partisans and there are practitioners, and you make no qualms about being a Democrat. We know where you're coming from. But you've been a chief of staff. You've helped to run campaigns, and that's why I like to get in your head a little bit here about this moment that we're in. Polls are tied. Everybody's doing gut check right now. Nobody really knows what they're talking about.
No.
How are you looking at the closing stages of this with the information that we have?
So the hardest part about running a campaign, and I've run several, is developing the model. What you're trying to do, every time you do a poll, you're running it through a model. What you're trying to predict with the model is what is the electorate going to look like on election day? And then you input the results you got from your polling and spits out a formula, and that's where you get. So the results you see in polling are calculated through a formula. They're not actually the actual raw numbers.
Put a big curve on this.
Correct. The problem is modeling is based on data, and we don't have any data to suggest how a lot of voters in this election are going to vote. For the first time in history, you're going to see partisan Republicans vote for a Democrat for president, Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney. You're going to see a bunch of people that have never voted in their lives come out and vote for Donald Trump.
You can't measure that.
You can't. There's no way. There's no way to measure it. So you're kind of basing it on gut experience a little bit. I suspect that if you're persuadable right now, 9 to 10, you're going to fall Kamala's way, because if you don't have an opinion on Donald Trump by now, you don't like him by now, you're never gonna. And so, but I do think he's got the big problem of taking these what we call low propensity voters who are scattered across America, particularly in rural areas, and you got to get them to vote for the very first time. They got to figure out how to register, where to show up, what ID to bring, how to do it.
Yes.
And when there's no muscle memory, that's a hard task. So they both have equally difficult tasks here. I just don't know which is going to. My gut is she will win because she has invested so much money in GOTV. So she not only is going to grow her reach into persuadables, she's also going to grow her base. So she can go both directions. He can only grow his base.
Okay, so that's your gut here.
Yeah.
To what extent is early voting factoring in to the way you're looking at this D's versus R's polling ballots, or is that too noisy because there are potentially R's polling ballots voting for Kamala Harris?
Right. So the assumption is that every R that votes votes for Donald Trump. We know that's not true this election. But you got to understand the fastest growing party in the country is independents or nonpartisan affiliates, depending on your state. You really have no idea how they're going to vote. You assume it's probably based on the polling 50-50, but we don't know. And the other thing is, the more important thing about early voting is the micro impact. Most campaigns have a universe of voters that they need to make sure they go vote because they know they are going to vote for them 100%. And for instance, like in the Democratic world, like pockets of older black voters, pockets of older women, or white college-educated women are going to vote. So in those pockets, we want to make sure as many people in those areas turn out as possible. So from a micro perspective, you're chasing each ballot. You're calling that voter. Have you voted yet? Every day to get them out to vote. That's really where it's about. That's where you can drive up your essentially want to bank as many votes as you can by election day.
Yes.
Because no one knows what happens on election day. You never know. Maybe there's a hurricane or there's a tornado or like bad weather or snow and that prevents people from voting. But if that happens, you want to make sure your side has already banked their votes.
How likely, how possible is it that as we hear Trump supporters are undersampled, that there are biases in polling that misrepresent Donald Trump's base? You could also wake up and say, wow, this was 5 points and the other direction.
So I equate this as, like I was a former chief of staff to a Florida member.
Yes.
We got in hurricanes, the models
Yes,
show it can
right.
get from Miami to D.C. That's where we are right now. We're a week out. We don't know where the hurricane's hitting. We don't know where
Spaghetti
it's
charts.
short. Yeah, spaghetti charts. Literally, I've seen models that can go to an overwhelmingly Kamala victory because we dramatically undercounted the number of independents and Republicans that are going to vote for her. And then in other areas, you could possibly see New York be closer than it has ever have because he's running up the numbers so high in rural America. Is that going to make enough difference? I've seen more models to suggest a Kamala victory than his, but it doesn't matter. You just need the one model to do it.
This is
great.
great.
Don't know how it's going to happen.
This is exactly the conversation that's taking place in strategy meetings in Washington. There's 1 minute left here, Brad. There's a thought that this will also, based on the last election, maybe take till the following Saturday. Where are you on votes being counted and races being called?
I suspect that we will know sooner. I think more Americans are getting more comfortable and confident in early in-person voting and voting by mail. You're even seeing Republicans come around to it, and that's where where a lot of people are trying to see the Republican surge in mail voting as some kind of sign of Republican strength. I'm like, no, your candidate 4 years ago was calling it illegal. So they've come around, dropped that rhetoric, and they're turning out. And so what we're looking at is how is that going to play out? I think what's likely to happen, we'll know the presidency soon.
Yeah.
It'll be the West Coast House races where we come down to control of the House. We may not know control of the House.
Presidency like by Thursday?
I predict we may know by Wednesday.
Wow.
Yeah.
Brad Howard, this is great. You know what that would have cost you to go to Corcoran Street Group to get that seminar? Thank you for being with us as always. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
12:21 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris, and stocks are inching higher. Bond traders slightly trimmed bets on Fed cuts after data showed the economy is going strong. We check markets for you all day long at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 10 points, NASDAQ up 26, and the Dow up 159 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.24% and the 2-year yield at 4.13%. The European Union is set to launch an investigation into Temu over concerns it is failing to curb the sale of illegal products online in a probe that could lead to hefty fines for the e-commerce service. The European Union will reportedly open formal proceedings against the platform run by Chinese-owned PDD Holdings to probe whether it is in breach of rules against illicit online activities. The latest read on third quarter GDP came in a little weaker than expected at 2.8%. Economists were looking for 2.9%. And after the close today, we get earnings from Microsoft and Meta Platforms. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew.
Amy Morris, thank you so much. Indeed, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, and thank you for spending part of your Wednesday with us here on Balance of Power. The fastest show in politics, a great deep dive with Brad Howard. I learned a lot there, and I hope you did too. We're going to try to bring you conversations like we just had with the founder of Corcoran Street Group every day until we get to Election Day here, because it's all gut check right now. The polls have made this not just a statistical dead heat, but a literal tie. If you look at the Bloomberg News swing state poll, or Siena College for that matter, we're seeing incredibly tight polling in a number of Senate races that we're going to be tracking a week from today, right? Some of these will still be up in the air the day after. One of them in Wisconsin, where Senator Tammy Baldwin is in the fight of her political life, it seems here. Recalling our conversation with Eric Hovde, her Republican challenger, was with us just 2 weeks ago here on Balance of Power. That's a 2-point race, at least according to USA Today, Suffolk University, and that is a poll that puts that well within the margin of error. It's another one that's simply too close to call. And in cases like these, we activate the asset, dispatching David Gura to the swing state of Wisconsin, where he sat down with the aforementioned Senator Baldwin, the Democrat, on her campaign bus a little bit earlier today, a conversation we brought you live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And David is with us right now from Wisconsin. Nice to see you in the thick of things, David. Appreciate your joining us here. I'd love to hear a little more about your conversation, but more broadly as well, the importance of a race like this one in deciding the balance of power in the U.S. Senate.
Joe, it's great to talk to you as always. I was here for that interview, but spent yesterday tagging along as Senator Baldwin made her way up the state. She's on a 5-day bus tour, and it was interesting just to listen to her stump speech. And what she said over and over again is, A, how close this race is going to be. She called it a 50-50 race. She characterized Wisconsin as the battleground state, acknowledging the importance of it. And to the question you just asked, she fully recognizes the importance of her race on the balance of power in the Senate, acknowledged the pressure that she's under in that regard. So that was the backdrop to our conversation. And again, I followed her from a meeting with members of a union down in Sturtevant, Wisconsin, up to Sheboygan, to Green Bay, where I am now. And you know, the issues that she talked about are those that would not surprise anybody who watches or listens to your show. She talked a lot about the economy, talked a lot about health care, talked about the Dobbs decision, and talked about the democracies at stake here in this election. That's what she said over and over again, Joe.
Are people turning out for her? David, to what extent have you been able to interface with voters? Is she reaching them directly? This is a lot about retail politics, of course, and trying to strike some familiarity with constituents.
There's a wonderful, you say retail politics, a lot of these events were intimate events. The first one with those union members took place at an apple orchard. I'd say there were a few dozen people there, most of whom were in a union local, and some had come in from out of state to knock on doors and canvass for her. We went to Sheboygan, where there was a bigger crowd at the Democratic headquarters there. In Green Bay, she campaigned with a woman running for Congress here in this city. People are coming out. She's trying to capitalize on their excitement. What she keeps stressing in those speeches is this is a race that really could come down to a handful of votes in a particular precinct. I mean, she's not exaggerating when she says that. You look at those poll results, it is so close. She was trying to convey to her supporters that, you know, if they're able to compel one voter, one person who, not undecided voters, it was clear she wasn't talking about those. She's talking about Democrats who might not have the wherewithal or the ability to get to the polls. If a person canvassing can get that person to commit to voting, that could make a huge difference in a lot of these precincts, Joe.
David Gura bringing us up close in the swing state of Wisconsin, where he interviewed Senator Tammy Baldwin a little bit earlier today. Both presidential candidates are in the state today, David. They're following you there. Donald Trump will be in Green Bay, where you are, with none other than Brett Favre. Kamala Harris will make her way to Madison, Wisconsin by the end of the day. And I wonder to what extent the senator's fortunes, her political future, rides on who wins the state of Wisconsin at the top of the ticket.
She talked about that an awful lot yesterday in those speeches about the importance of voting Democrat all the way up and down, and a bit of nuance here. The maps have been redone for assembly seats in this state, which makes Democrats more viable. That's encouraging more Democratic candidates to run, and she thinks that's going to get more Democrats to the poll on Election Day. But we talked casually just about how many of these national figures are coming to the state. Yes, on the Democratic side, on the Republican side as well. It's a state that's attracting a lot of attention, as you heard from Eric Hovde, a lot of money as well, both from the candidates and their campaigns and from other national groups as well. So, as you say, tonight, shaping up to be a big event here with Donald Trump coming to town. Brett Favre, of course, widely beloved in Green Bay. We'll see what kind of draw he gets. He's going to be in Wisconsin again tomorrow, I believe. And then that bus tour that I mentioned that the senator's on is going to end in Madison, her hometown. And she's really counting on, as many candidates are, the excitement of that national ticket being in town here to pull more Democrats to the polls.
He's crossing the country for us in the swing states today, Wisconsin, in an important interview. David Gura, thank you so much. David will be back with us in our second hour here on Balance of Power with another report, and we'll bring you into his interview with the senator. Sit down for a couple of moments on the campaign bus. David Gura, of course, the host of the Big Take podcast, which is focused quite a lot lately on this presidential campaign and the down ballot races, and will be part of our special coverage next Tuesday evening in another swing state. We'll have more on that as we bring in Wendy Benjaminson, our political editor here in Washington, D.C., who helped to run our Bloomberg News swing state poll for the better part of a year. Wendy, it's great to see you, and I wonder if we might just start right where David Gura is standing in Wisconsin. Why is this state so important that both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are back there again today?
Well, it's one of those must-win states, Joe. Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the so-called blue wall, those manufacturing industrial states with a lot of blue-collar workers, you know, very liberal pockets in each of those states, and big electoral prizes that are not slam dunks like California, New York, or Texas. So those are critical states. And as you know, they've planted themselves in Pennsylvania for a while. And in these last few days, they're also hitting Michigan and Wisconsin.
Important developments today in Wisconsin that I want to ask you about. It comes from the Supreme Court here, Wendy. The Supreme Court has refused to order the removal of RFK Jr. from the ballots in both Wisconsin and Michigan. Right, so these are two of the blue wall states you're talking about. Knowing how tight this race is, based on our polling, you throw in a wild card like RFK Jr. in just those two states, he picks up 1% even. It could be the difference in the result of this election.
You are so right, Joe. He could pick up even a few hundred, a few thousand votes of people who think, well, isn't he with Trump? Sure, I'll pick him, you know. I mean, there could be very innocent, you know, people who think that that vote is going to count. He has left the race and endorsed Donald Trump, but the fact that he is on the ballot, and I should say the Supreme Court denied his request to take him off the ballot because he had he asked to be taken off too late. The ballots are printed. Millions of people have participated in early voting.
Correct.
It's just too darn late to get off the ballot. So yes, it actually could make a difference, just as Trump's the comedians at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally making those awful jokes about Puerto Ricans and other people, but the Puerto Ricans one in particular could tip the balance in Pennsylvania, where there is a sizable of some sort Puerto Rican population. Anything could tip the balance at this point.
That's how close we are. Wendy, another important ruling from the Supreme Court today. It hits close to home for those of us who live in the Washington, D.C. area. It's the state of Virginia, as a matter of fact. We talked about a lower court ruling on this already. The Supreme Court is allowing Virginia to purge some 1,600 residents from its voter rolls. This is despite a lower court ruling that the purge violated federal law. It's something that Glenn Youngkin had asked for, the Republican governor, and it revolves around the state's use of citizenship data from the DMV. A lot of people say this could lead to eligible voters being removed from the rolls. Wendy, how significant is this?
It's terrifically significant, especially in Virginia, which is a purely purple state. The D.C. suburbs are reliable Democratic strongholds. Some of the cities like the college towns like Charlottesville are Democratic, but there's a whole bunch of rural Virginia that is red. And so it is a purple state, which means it could go any way. And this effort by the Republican governor, a Trump ally, Glenn Youngkin, who has decided he's worried about illegal immigrants voting and wants to purge these 1,600 voters from the rolls. There is black letter federal law that gives a deadline for doing that, and 6 days before the election is after that deadline. The Supreme Court didn't say why they decided to let him go ahead. 3 liberal justices dissented. There's no indication what they were thinking, but this could really not only mess up the enfranchisement of these 1,600 voters, but also the count in Virginia that night. If those voters are in doubt, whether their vote is legal, is in doubt, and they've already voted, then it really, in this tight a race, it could mess things up.
Well, of course, Virginia is not a swing state. You could argue 1,600 votes wouldn't make a difference in the outcome here, Wendy, but what could this mean for other states in terms of their own litigation?
Well, I don't know if there would actually be time at this point, but lots of other states want to do the same thing. Republicans are sort of pushing this idea that illegal immigrants are voting in large numbers, and Donald Trump goes so far as to say that Democrats are pushing them to vote in large numbers, which that's simply not true. There's no evidence of that. And studies have shown that illegal immigrants, they don't want to be deported. And to take a risk to fake ID, Virginia has some pretty strict ID laws when you cast a ballot. The idea that there are large numbers of illegal immigrants that would risk deportation to vote in a presidential election they're not eligible for is just not happening. So, but a lot of Republicans want to purge voter rolls of some Latino voters based on this idea.
Wendy, I've got less than a minute. Everybody in the last couple of days seems to think this is going to be an earlier call than we had thought, just as recently as a week ago. What's up with that? Are you still bracing for days, if not a week or more?
Well, I'm certainly bracing for days. Last time, during the height of the pandemic, when everyone or many people were voting by mail, it took till Saturday for the race to be called for Joe Biden. And that's partly because of the rules of counting mail-in ballots and such. This time, fewer people are voting by mail, but it's so close that, yes, I do think it's certainly not going to be Tuesday night or Wednesday. That's my prognostication. I'll eat my words on this show if you want me to in a couple of weeks.
And no, are you kidding? We believe what Wendy says. Wendy Benjaminson with us in Washington. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
12:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Supermicro Computers auditor Ernst & Young resigned right in the middle of an audit, sending SMCI stock into free fall. Shares of Supermicro Computer now 32% lower. Ernst & Young auditors resigned, citing concerns about the company's governance and transparency. Scrutiny has intensified on Supermicro since a former employee alleged earlier this year in federal court that the company had sought to overstate its revenue. We do check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got green across the screen. The S&P 500 up 10 points. NASDAQ up 32 points. The Dow up 134 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.24% and the 2-year yield at 4.14%. Online commerce outlet Temu may soon be under investigation by the European Union. Sources say the European Commission will be opening formal proceedings against Temu, which is run by Chinese-owned PDD Holdings, to probe whether it broke rules against illicit online activities, including the sale of illegal products. America's housing market got a boost in September. Fresh industry data show contract signings to buy a previously owned home registered the largest increase in more than 4 years in September, thanks to lower mortgage rates and an increase in the number of available homes on the market. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now whenever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back now to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew.
Amy Morris, thank you so much. Appreciate your being with us here on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. We're less than a week out. We can actually say that now, knowing, of course, that millions of people have already voted. So the closing arguments that we're hearing from Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are important to fewer voters by the day. And of course, a lot of people are going to be out there voting in real time on Election Day. But the early vote has really brought a whole new wrinkle to this story, much like it did in 2020. And Republicans are showing up. That's why it was important to follow the Harris and Trump campaigns last evening. Now, this has all devolved into an argument about the use of the word garbage, from Madison Square Garden on Sunday night to Joe Biden in the White House last night. But we're going to do our best to compartmentalize a little bit of this, to look individually at each campaign, specific to yesterday, before Joe Biden dropped the garbage line. It was Kamala Harris, about 1,000 feet in front of him there, in front of the White House on the ellipse, right? We brought you to the ellipse on the late edition of Balance of Power. It was the same exact staging with the flags, the podium, the ballistic glass, the whole bit that Donald Trump used on January 6, 2021. Kamala Harris choosing to go there, the White House lit up at night behind her to deliver this message.
And those who came before us, they did not struggle, sacrifice, and lay down their lives only to see us cede our fundamental freedoms. We are not a vessel for the schemes of wannabe dictators. The United States of America is the greatest idea humanity ever devised.
And she tried to connect the dots. This wasn't just about Donald Trump, threat to democracy, which you would think would come with those optics. She tried to connect the dots, as we told you in advance, to people's daily anxieties, concerns, and emotions, their thoughts about the economy, healthcare, and immigration. Did it work? Let's assemble our panel. Rick Davis is with us, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist and Bloomberg Politics contributor, joined today by Laura Fink, Rebel Communications founder, CEO, Democratic strategist. Great to see you both. Laura, I'll start with you as the Democrat. There were concerns about a muddled message here and the very presence of Kamala Harris in the nation's capital as opposed to a swing state. Was the exercise worth it last night?
I thought her closing argument was one for the books. She certainly was able to connect and center the American people at the center of her argument. She opened with the line where she said, this is about you, this is about your family, and this is about the future of the country that we love. So she really raised the stakes and talked. And if you hadn't been tuned into the campaign at all and you watched that speech, you would see the narrative. You would see the issues that she is focused on in her campaign. You would hear about her personal history and her career history, and you would connect to the rhetoric that was really about country over party. In some ways, it could have been a speech from a John McCain as she centers her argument around those swing voters that remain out there. And a lot of them are conservative or lean conservative in terms of the ones who are probably going to vote but don't know who they're going to vote for. So I thought it was a speech that also focused on unity and division, and the contrast that she drew with Donald Trump, whether you were talking about healthcare or kitchen table issues or democracy, small d democracy, and division versus unity. All of the elements were there in a rhetorical fashion that was really beautifully rendered.
Well, Rick, your ears must be burning. I don't know if you heard a McCain-esque speech there. She is getting great credit for a very well-written speech, if not a well-delivered one. And there were tens of thousands of people out there on the ellipse. If you're with us on YouTube, we're showing you a video from last night. People stood in line for like a half a mile to get into this. I appreciate the essence of the message, Rick, but who's listening outside of Washington? Who is listening? Who isn't already planning to vote for Kamala Harris? Because I talk to people, and I still don't think people are paying attention the way we assume they are. How about you?
I don't know about that, Joe. I'm a true believer. First of all, Laura made my heart pound a little faster just mentioning John McCain in a speech that attacked dictators and talked about putting your country first. Yes, I thought it was McCain-esque speech. I thought it was one of the best speeches she's given. It should have been the convention speech and carried forward every single day with those themes, most of which she did repeat in various stages of the campaign. But one that stood out was new, and that was this idea of protecting people, protecting you. I thought that actually did sort of connect with the individual, which is what voters think of themselves. They don't think of themselves as PACs or parties. They think of themselves as individuals, and I thought the speech did a good job there. And I do think that there are people out looking for that connection, right? They've not seen it up to this point in time in some cases. We've heard a lot of people say that Donald Trump, you either love him or hate him. You've had lots of time to think about it. There are no undecideds about that man. It's about turnout with him. But Harris has not had the real-time experience of connecting with voters for a long period of time as a candidate for president. And so I do think there's still a class of individuals who are out there making up their mind. And it may be one of the reasons why you don't have as many early voters right now in this stage of the election as you had in 2020. That all being said, you also probably will have an election that is decided in 7 states by less than 100,000 votes. So yes, a couple votes here, a couple votes there, lots of precincts put in together means that you don't want to leave any stone unturned. And so I do think there are still persuadables. There are still people who are on the shelf trying to figure out where they come down. And I think that speech is probably a helpful reminder of that. The venue I thought was horrific. I mean, right in front of the White House. And who makes himself known? But Dark Brandon showed up yesterday with an attack on, voters that support Trump. And I mean, it couldn't have been a worse time to vent or a worse location.
All right, Laura, let's get into this. We were kind of wondering what would happen if Joe Biden walked out onto the balcony there during the speech. It was noteworthy, I guess, that he was not invited, but he became part of the event, or at least the aftermath, with this garbage line here. I know that the White House has tried to clarify this. You also know that perception is reality. Republicans are comparing this to this is the new deplorables line. Did Joe Biden wreck the night for Kamala Harris? Rick is talking about every vote mattering, and people seem to be taking this personally. What do you think?
Oh, I think the Republicans are eager to change the subject from the foul-mouthed comedian that was bashing Puerto Ricans and virtually people of every stripe in his remarks just a couple of days ago. So I think this is more of a pivot. Kamala Harris, it's more about how she handles that. And one thing I would say, what a contrast in how they handle their campaigns and how they approach them. And so Biden has a storied history of gaffes at the microphone, and this is just the latest. But it was was her ability to pivot away from that I thought was the mark of her skill as a candidate. And she turned it into an opportunity to draw a contrast with Biden, to show that she is not Biden, because she directly opposed what he said, even after he clarified his remarks. So I thought she handled it as well as it could possibly be handled. And if you're paying attention to these micro moves, you're watching how the candidate you're thinking about voting for potentially is handling it, not the guy who's in the White House about to retire.
It's unfortunate, I suppose, Rick, it doesn't matter really what you think Joe Biden's intentions were here. This is what we're talking about instead of the closing argument. And we did hear from Kamala Harris earlier today. Very interesting choice of words, choice of tone, because a lot of people woke up this morning, Rick, and asked, is this her moment? Does she separate herself from Joe Biden, if not condemn what he said? We caught up with Kamala Harris on the tarmac. The press pool did on her way out of town earlier. Here she is.
First of all, he clarified his comments, but let me be clear. I strongly disagree with any criticism of people based on who they vote for. You heard my speech last night and continuously throughout my career. I believe that the work that I do is about representing all the people, whether they support me or not. And as President of the United States, I will be a president for all Americans, whether you vote for me or not.
How'd she do there, Rick Davis? Should she have said Joe Biden was wrong?
I think she basically did. I think Laura got it right. It is how you react to this. We saw J.D. Vance react to the comedian at the Madison Square Garden saying, "Oh, I didn't hear it. You were there, for heaven's sakes. What do you mean you didn't hear it?" That's a dodge. This wasn't a dodge. She could have tried to accept Biden's characterization of it, and that would have been a trap. She didn't. And so, yeah, I think she did what she needed to do to dispatch it. And look, I mean, this closing of the last 2 weeks of this campaign have been the sloppiest that we've seen in modern political history. I mean, both campaigns are doing their dangdest to try and upset their own momentum. And so, look, I think she probably makes this a one-day story, the way she reacted to it. And 75,000 people on the mall and a good speech is probably going to carry the day on that. So different than how Republicans handled the Madison Square Garden debacle.
Well, that's for sure. You just wonder if there is any lasting impact in either of these. There's so much talk, Laura, about October surprises. We're 6 days out. Is this it?
Well, I'd rather be Kamala at this point than Trump, given, and sure, but I think both sidesing this in terms of mistakes. I mean, the impact on Puerto Ricans of those comments are being felt in the streets. You saw it in Allentown when Puerto Ricans gathered before Trump came there just days after. They are buzzing. Radio stations are having call-ins. Families are talking about it. WhatsApp texts are going out across states. And so I think the impact of this week's events on the Trump side is far more regrettable than the commentary, the regrettable commentary of President Biden, especially because he's not the campaign. He was not invited to say those things. So I want to be careful of drawing a false equivalency here. I also want to say that the people that are on the table, you could hear in Kamala's remarks that she was addressing them directly, tailoring her remarks to them. They're people that are tired of the division. They are concerned about economic issues, and they're concerned about the future of the country, and they may not have voted for a Democrat consistently before. So all of those things were woven into her messaging. On the other side, it's kind of an own goal, because Donald Trump is leaning into sort of his greatest hits on immigration and other things, but there really is no closing argument for those swing voters. He has essentially written them off, which I think is an advantage for Harris, because he's not even trying to persuade them or meet them where they are at. Around the things that I just talked about. So it's definitely Kamala Harris has the wind at her back, simply because Trump has decided to kick the ball in his own goal.
4 separate appearances yesterday. Donald Trump chose not to apologize for the jokes at Madison Square Garden. It strikes me, Rick Davis, we've got less than a minute left here. The Supreme Court choosing to keep Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the ballot in Wisconsin and Michigan could be more impactful than any other rhetoric we're talking about here. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a drain. It's not totally clear to me, like, who it actually affects the most. He's become a part of the Trump campaign, and anybody who cast a ballot over the last month for him would more likely be pro-Trump than pro-Harris. So, you scratch your head and you try and guess who's still out there who's, not paying attention enough to know that he actually doesn't want to be president of the United States anymore. So we'll see.
Right. Rick Davis, great conversation, and Laura Fink, our panel today. They'll be back in hour number 2 with a lot more to talk about here. 6 days to go on the fastest show in politics. We'll welcome our global TV audience coming up at the top of the hour, so stay with us right here on Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's back to the swing states because nothing else matters. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the presidential candidates today return to Pennsylvania North Carolina and Wisconsin. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington today. Kaylee, we've got our eyes specifically on Wisconsin. Both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are there.
Yep.
And we have an important interview with a Democratic senator from that state in the political fight of her life.
Yeah, the incumbent Tammy Baldwin in a race against the Republican Eric Hovde in a state that is getting even tighter in the Senate race and, of course, in the presidential race as well, as goes pretty much all of the battlegrounds that we are watching. There's a tight Senate race in Michigan as well, as Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are neck and neck. They're looking at how all of this picture of the ballot comes together with 6 days to go until the election day. Keeping in mind as well, they're going to be in North Carolina, both of them today, a state that already, according to the Secretary of State who spoke with us on this program yesterday, has had more than 3 million people already cast a ballot.
More than a third of voters in the early voting that has been at least trackable in terms of D's and R's would suggest that a lot more Republicans are showing up than expected in some cases. There are questions, though, about whether we see party flipping. If some of those Republican ballots are for Kamala Harris, potentially vice versa. And we're going to go to the state of Wisconsin, Green Bay, where we find David Gura and that important interview from earlier today.
Yeah, we'll also be joined by former Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, who was a member of the January 6th committee, as we recap the speech given on the ellipse last night by Vice President Kamala Harris. Of course, the scene where Donald Trump spoke on that day back in 2021. So we have much more ahead this hour, but we begin as always with a check on the markets. And Amy Morris has a look from here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Kaylee. Supermicro Computer shares now down 33% after Ernst & Young resigned while conducting an audit of that company. In its resignation letter, Ernst & Young stated they could not rely on what management was telling them, and they did not want to be associated with the financial statements prepared by management. We do check your markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 is up 4 points, NASDAQ up 14, and the Dow is up 71 points. The Russell 2000 index up 9 points. The 10-year Treasury yield is at 4.25%, and the 2-year yield at 4.13%. Eli Lilly lowered its full-year guidance on lackluster sales of its blockbuster weight loss drugs, Zepbound and Mounjaro. The company's shares are down 8% after raising its guidance twice this year. Lilly now expects full-year sales to top out at $46 billion. That cuts $600 million off the prior upper end of its outlook. Companies added 233,000 jobs in October. That's the most in more than a year, according to private payroll provider ADP, before the government's report comes out on Friday. And the latest read on third quarter GDP came in just a bit weaker than expected at 2.8%. Economists were looking for 2.9%. After the close today, we'll get earnings from Microsoft and Meta Platforms. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where we have an eye on the campaign trail and some news we've gotten from the highest court in the country that is shaping the way this is going to go down within the last 24 hours. They've ruled that Virginia can remove voters from voter rolls who are found to be non-citizens based on DMV data, also ruling that RFK Jr., who is no longer in the presidential race, he has backed Donald Trump, will stay on the ballot in 2 crucial swing states, Michigan and Wisconsin. And I was fascinated, Joe, by new data we got from CNN, a poll conducted by SSRS, that finds Michigan is a lead for Harris, 48-43. Compared to Donald Trump. In Wisconsin, she's leading 51-45. And RFK Jr. in those states has 3% support in Michigan.
Imagine.
1% support in Wisconsin. So he
Enough to
could
tip
be
the
a
scale.
factor here.
To think it's these 2 states.
Yeah.
Somehow we've left out Pennsylvania here. But these 2 incredibly important blue wall states, RFK Jr. on the ballot, even a 0.5 percentage point could tip the scale here. Remembering it was a 0.3% gap in our Bloomberg News swing state poll, fewer as close as Wisconsin. And the fact of the matter is, the same can be said for the Senate race there. Too close to call within the margin. In the most recent data that I could find, Suffolk University with USA Today, a 2-point race between Senator Tammy Baldwin and her Republican challenger, Eric Hovde, who joined us on the program here 2 weeks ago. It's Senator Baldwin's turn now. The Democrat from Wisconsin sat down on her campaign bus earlier today with Bloomberg's David Gura, who is crisscrossing the country for us, landing today in the swing state of Wisconsin, and he joins us right now from Green Bay. David, what'd you learn?
We talked a lot about the economy, as you might expect, and I think there is a really clear distinction to be drawn between these two candidates on that issue. You mentioned the interview that you did a couple of weeks ago with Eric Hovde, and he's a fascinating character in many ways. He is somebody who is a banker with a lot of money and spends a lot of time in California, as Tammy Baldwin is very fond of pointing out. But he has kind of a nuanced plan for what he might do with healthcare, a nuanced plan for what he might do with taxes, and so we kind of grounded some of our conversation this morning with Senator Baldwin on the issue of taxation. She noted that he is in favor largely of extending those Trump-era tax cuts. She said that she's in favor of kind of a more tailored approach, trying to help those working class and middle class voters who've been her bulwark of support for many years, both in the House and the Senate. I've been traveling with her over the course of these last couple of days. She's taking a bus around this state. We started out in the southern part of Wisconsin, made our way to Sheboygan yesterday, then Green Bay today. When we were in Sheboygan, I talked to somebody about what that city is like historically, what it's like today. And we talked an awful lot about manufacturing. And he said, look around here, there used to be all of these great companies. Kohler, of course, which makes faucets and sinks and any number of things you might find in your kitchen or your bathroom, used to have a huge footprint in that city. It's been greatly reduced. I asked her what she would say to him about the state of manufacturing in this state. Take a listen to what she had to say.
I consider myself one of the Buy America champion of the United States Senate. So when we're passing big pieces of legislation, I'm like, we got to make sure there's Buy America rules attached to this. And I was successful in getting permanent Buy America rules attached to the infrastructure bill, to the Chips and Science Act, to the Inflation Reduction Act. That is bringing jobs back to Wisconsin right now and keeping some jobs here that might otherwise have left.
So she has affixed those to a lot of these spending bills, and it has made a difference, she told me during that interview today. But she has an opponent who is largely lock in step with former President Trump on the issue of tariffs and making promises that we could see a renaissance of manufacturing in this state, in this country, where a lot of these companies would come back. That's what she's up against. The former president is going to be here tonight in Green Bay for a big rally. As you mentioned, Kamala Harris, the vice president, is going to be in this state as well. So as you might expect, the economy front and center for Senator Baldwin and for a lot of the folks that she was talking to as I was on the campaign trail with her yesterday, guys.
Well, yeah, and we know former President Trump, when he is in Wisconsin this evening, will be alongside Brett Favre, the former Packers quarterback. So once again, we're seeing these campaigns leaning on the power of celebrity in these final days. David, give us a sense of also what Wisconsin is like right now in terms of early voting. How many ballots have already been cast, and therefore how many minds could be influenced to vote for Baldwin or Hovde or Trump or Harris for that matter?
Well, Senator Baldwin's campaign is really pushing her supporters to vote early, saying it will lessen the load on poll workers. Find the time to do it. It'll make things go more smoothly on Election Day itself. But you bring up these kind of celebrity-studded events that both of these National Party candidates are holding here. I think it's a really interesting contrast between that, and yes, Senator Baldwin will be at the event with Kamala Harris in Madison later today, with the kind of events that she was holding yesterday. These were pretty small events with a few dozen people, volunteers who are knocking on doors, doing the hard work of trying to convince largely fellow Democrats to make sure that they get off the couch, leave their homes, go and vote early or on Election Day. And she was really giving them kind of her advice on how to do that. Come to those doors with a reason why they're doing it, enumerate what the issues are that are important to them, and then seal the deal, as she put it. Get them to commit to voting in this election. You talked at the top just about how close these polls are, how thin these margins are. She is very aware of that, talked about that a lot during the course of the speeches that I heard yesterday, and really was making the case to those volunteers that if they can secure really just a handful of people to go to the polls more, that could have a fundamental difference at the precinct level across this state.
Turnout is everything in Wisconsin and elsewhere. David Gura, Bloomberg correspondent, live in Wisconsin. Thank you so much. Great interview with Senator Baldwin as we consider here what it is going to take to turn people out who may still be undecided as to whether they want to vote at all in this cycle. Interesting as we away here the closing messages of the campaigns to try to drive that. For Kamala Harris, as we saw evidence yesterday at the Ellipse here in Washington, in part this argument is about protecting democracy.
In a world where turnout matters, I guess you could say crowd size is an indication. 75,000 people on the Ellipse. They had to get an additional permit, I guess, to allow these people in. We saw images of people in line for a half a mile to get into this. The question is, who outside of Washington was watching and listening as Kamala Harris did address the nation from the Ellipse? And what will be very familiar, if you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, very familiar optics. Same staging, Same podium, flags, same location where Donald Trump spoke in front of the White House on January 6th. Here's Kamala Harris from last night.
On day one, if elected, Donald Trump would walk into that office with an enemies list. When elected, I will walk in with a to-do list. Full of priorities of what I will get done for the American people. And I will work with everyone, Democrats, Republicans, and independents.
For more on this, we're joined now here in our Washington, D.C. studio by former Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida, who was a member of the Select Committee that investigated the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Congresswoman, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Thank you for being with us. You obviously have spent countless time pouring through Trump's speech at the Ellipse that he gave on that day, everything that happened in the aftermath. To see Kamala Harris yesterday standing in that same spot with this kind of messaging, what did it make you think?
It made me think that she's continuing to run a very disciplined campaign, and that speech was meant to be both a visual and a verbal contrast to Donald Trump. You know, and it actually, just as an American, gave me hope to see a more normal politician using the backdrop of the White House to deliver messages that were about unity and also about the substance of what it is that she's going to do. She did remind people of what he called for. He asked people to fight like hell when he last stood on that stage in front of that White House and to attack the Capitol. He was going to go with them, but then he decided not to. And so I think in part she was doing a little bit of a persuadable with a contrast message, but she was also giving those people who are a little Trump shy because of how they feel he behaved on January 6th, a reminder of why they shouldn't vote for him and continue to be a part of this broader coalition that she's trying to build.
She's getting high remarks on a well-written speech, if not also a well-delivered one, but there were questions about the very venue that we're describing here. Powerful optics last night, but in a tied presidential campaign in 7 swing states, a lot of politicos said, why Washington? That's the last place you'd want to be seen. How about you?
I think one of the things that she has been criticized for, people, when you talk to focus groups, they wonder whether or not she can be presidential. The way that stage was set up with the flags in the White House, that was to provide the image of what it would look like for her to be presidential. And, you know, as you said, people have given really high marks to the way she delivered that speech and what it was she said. It was her showing the American people that she is able to be presidential.
Well, as she was trying to show what she would be like as president, the person who is currently president almost simultaneously perhaps caused a bit of an issue for her campaign. Joe Biden, in a virtual call with Photo Latino, whether he intended to or not, referred to Trump supporters as garbage. How much of the progress Harris made on that stage last night, if any, was undone by that gaffe?
I think that gaffe is the reason why so many Democrats were relieved when he chose to step aside, because it's gaffes like that that really create headlines and draw the attention away from some of the things that the Trump campaign is doing. I mean, they had a very insulting comedian come up, and they, unlike Harris, have not stepped away from their comments. She has said very clearly that she does not disparage anybody who has different political opinions than hers, and that she plans to represent everybody, whether they worked with her or elected her or not. And you haven't seen that kind of distance created between Trump and what the comedian said about Puerto Ricans and about other minority groups.
Did you like the way Kamala Harris handled that this morning? Should she have been more forceful in distancing herself from Joe Biden or condemning the remark?
I think she was very clear where she was condemning the remark. I think on a number of issues where she has been attacked, she has been very clear in using language that shuts out any doubt of where she stands. I'll give a good example. When she was speaking to Telemundo in the Latino community, she called herself a pragmatic capitalist. And the only way to blunt the socialist attacks against her that resonate with that community is to identify herself as a pragmatic capitalist. And so I think taking those messages head on as she has is the right thing to do.
Well, and she has 6 days still to make those messages resonate, but then election day will be upon us. Obviously, voting is well underway in a lot of places across the country. But what are you hearing, especially with those you worked with, looking into the events of January 6th and the efforts to overturn the results of the last election about what is taking place, even down to the local level at polling places? What are you bracing for on Election Day and in the aftermath?
You know, I think there's a lot of concern, obviously, because a third of the country still doesn't believe that the 2020 election was a free and fair outcome. And so we're up against a lot of headwinds, but I think there's been a lot of progress that has been made. The Congress passed election reform laws that would raise the threshold, or did raise the threshold on the number of members that would need to contest and vote not to certify to 20%. So that's a little bit better than where we were standing in 2020. So, and then I think at the local level, people have been making efforts to ensure that the process is transparent and that they can deliver a free and fair election as our democracy deserves.
You made reference, Congresswoman, to the remarks that we heard at Madison Square Garden on Sunday night, the lack of an apology that we've, I guess, not heard from the Trump campaign in this case. What does this mean in terms of an impact on Latino voters who were offended by this Puerto Rico garbage island line in a state like yours in Florida?
So in Florida, I'm a little concerned that the margins might be so significant from a lot of the other groups that you may not see a difference. But in Pennsylvania, certainly with 400,000 Puerto Ricans, you're going to see some difference. I represented one of the communities that had the highest number of Puerto Rican in my district when I was in Congress, and they're deeply proud people, deeply offended by what was said. And it reinforces this sense that the island is an afterthought for the Trump administration, especially in the way that they handled Maria.
Well, we saw Rick Scott didn't waste any time responding. So
yeah, that's the politician in him, understanding that he has a statewide reelect, and he can't afford to let any group go.
Some Democrats we've spoken with have suggested that reelect he could actually lose. Do you believe that when you look at some of those same demographics you were just alluding to in Florida?
Well, I certainly hope that that's the case, but I also understand that elections are more than just about selling hope. They're about having field operations and a strong ground game and infrastructure within the state. And while I hope that happens, I'm concerned a little bit about the state broadly.
Did you have a word for the vice president after that speech last night? I know she invited you to be there.
No, I didn't speak with her.
What would you have told her when she was done?
Well, that I am looking forward to a new generation of leadership in this country, and that it's time that we do move past all of this. And that I certainly appreciate her drawing contrast between someone who has an enemies list, since I think I might be on that one, and somebody who has a to-do list focused on serving the American people.
It's good to see you back in Washington. Thanks, as always, for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Former Democratic Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy from Florida with us at the table here in Washington. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines here on the fastest show in politics. Glad you're with us here, Kaylee. We'll have to assemble the panel next.
Yep, Rick and Laura are going to be with us today as we continue to assess these final 6 days of the campaign as the candidates are crisscrossing the swing states as we speak. We'll have more ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 121 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks are inching higher as bond traders slightly trimmed bets on Fed cuts after data showed the economy is going strong. We check those markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 up 5.5 points, NASDAQ up 12, and the Dow up 113. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.25% and the 2-year yield at 4.14%. Volkswagen has laid out a cost savings plan that officials say could avoid having to close plants. The company's chief negotiator says the plan includes a 10% wage reduction, a new bonus system, and a new sustainable wage agreement. Shares of Volkswagen now up 0.4%. Airbus SE reiterated its goal for 770 aircraft deliveries in 2024, sticking to the closely watched target despite supply chain glitches. Airbus announced third quarter adjusted earnings that topped estimates. Shares for Airbus now 0.4% lower. And after the close today, we do get earnings from Microsoft and Meta Platforms. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's return now to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington. This is Balance of Power, a show in which we've spent the last several days talking about the aftermath of the Sunday rally at Madison Square Garden, where Donald Trump and a number of other speakers were there. And of course, many of their remarks made some noise in political circles and elsewhere, reverberating well through swing states like Pennsylvania that have high Puerto Rican populations, specific to, of course, the joke made by comedian Tony Hinchcliffe about Puerto Rico being an island of garbage. But if you thought the garbage references were going to end there, they did not, because then President Joe Biden, in a virtual call with Voto Latino last night, had this to say about who's garbage.
And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
Now, the White House has gone out of its way to try to clarify Joe Biden's remarks, suggesting that this is a matter of punctuation, that was a possessive. It's the powerful apostrophe that we were missing there. Didn't stop the Trump campaign from raising money on it. An email blast went out immediately after saying, "You are not garbage. I love you. You are the best our nation has to offer." Kamala Harris was called to respond on her way out of town this morning, on her way to the swing states once again. Reporters caught up with her on the tarmac. Here's how she framed it.
First of all, he clarified his comments, but let me be clear. I strongly disagree with any criticism of people based on who they vote for. You heard my speech last night and continuously throughout my career. I believe that the work that I do is about representing all the people, whether they support me or not. And as President of the United States, I will be a president for all Americans, whether you vote for me or not.
Does it move the needle in this campaign? We assemble our political panel to explore that question. Rick Davis is with us, Republican strategist, Bloomberg politics contributor, and partner at Stone Court Capital. Joined today by Laura Fink, Rebel Communications founder and CEO, Democratic strategist. Great to have you both with us here. Rick, what's your thought on the noise around this whole controversy, the cleanup, the response? Does this actually impact a voter who hasn't already made up their mind?
You know, almost by abstention. I mean, in other words, if you're talking about cleaning up, your comments or trying to do damage control around somebody else's at your event, you're not actually making the pitch to voters. This is your last chance to pitch directly to voters. You want to be talking about things they care about, not trying to play, clean up with the media over some controversy that's self-inflicted. And in both these cases, they were self-inflicted. I would say advantage Harris only because, the comments by the president aren't going to disrupt anybody voting for Harris because they were about people who've already made a decision to vote for Trump, right? It's kind of self-identified. Yeah. But the attacks on Puerto Ricans at his event in Madison Square Garden will directly affect how Puerto Rican voters in places like Pennsylvania, where it just was yesterday, look at his candidacy and who they're going to vote for. So it's not a moral equivalent. One has a potential voter impact and the other probably doesn't.
Well, so when we consider the actual voter, the campaign impact, Laura, we were just speaking with former Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, who said this from Biden last night, whether intended or not, this kind of gaffe is why Democrats are glad he is no longer the candidate. So if that is the thought here, what role should he be playing on the next 6 days of this campaign, the last 6 days of this campaign, if any? I think we may be muted, Laura. There we go.
Oh, can you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay. I was just saying that he can stand down. That's the role that an incumbent president should play. And I think in particular because of the gender dynamics, because she's running to be the first woman president of the United States. She doesn't need the shadow of Joe Biden, and also he's unpopular. So he knows to stand down. He has stood down for the last several months, and he should do the same. This kind of gaffe, I agree with the Congresswoman. This is why the change needed to happen. This is why you see Kamala Harris with precision and message discipline as she turned his gaffe back to her consistent themes of unity and a lack of division and a lack of the ugliness. So she was able to pivot, but he did, I agree with Rick, he stole a day. There's an opportunity cost here for the Harris campaign, where she gave an incredible speech last night to unify the country, and he's immediately distracting from that. So it's a bummer, but these are the things that happen in campaigns, and you got to keep going.
It's not like Joe Biden was a major feature on the campaign trail for Kamala Harris at this point, Laura. Will we not see him again on a stage with her between now and next Tuesday?
I don't think you'll. I don't think you're going to see him before Election Day. He knows the best thing that he can do is to stand aside. And in fact, letting people lead and playing the role that is required and needed of you is what the entire Democratic surrogate operation has done quite well. I would say it's a significant advantage over Trump's, not just in terms of the diversity and the size of the surrogate base, but also their willingness to lean in and to go where they are going to be most effective. We saw it with surrogates like Michelle Obama and Barack Obama. We saw it with Republican Liz Cheney. We are seeing it with the generals that are coming out in their own way and striking a contrast between Harris and Trump. So the team is hitting its marks, and this is just one misstep one day.
Well, so as we consider the words of Joe Biden here, Rick, I'd like to talk about some of the words Donald Trump is using, specifically as it pertains to the vote in Pennsylvania. He posted on True Social this morning, alleging that there is, quote, cheating in Pennsylvania. Others followed up. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from Georgia, suggested that the steal is on in Pennsylvania, perhaps here laying the groundwork to contest the results of that state. But what might that signal to you, Rick, about the internals the Trump campaign is seeing if Donald Trump is already saying this thing was stolen?
Yeah, we actually are seeing a pretty aggressive push in the collar counties around Philadelphia on early vote. Probably not great for the Trump campaign. And my guess is as soon as you started seeing that is when these claims of theft or irregularities cropped up. When I talk to people who are involved in election law, they don't think they've had anything unusual happen in Pennsylvania other than the typical election week or election month activity related to balloting. And so he's working the ref. He's already laying out the predicate that if he loses, I don't think there's anybody I know who would question that he will call foul. He'll get his lawyers to issue a bunch of lawsuits against various jurisdictions, all in targeted states, all in targeted counties, to try and contest the election once again. The fact that he's doing it before we've even voted is actually pretty typical. He did it in 2016, even when he won. And obviously he did it very aggressively before the vote in 2020. So I think that this is just another one of these things that is a distraction. But it does remind voters that this is the kind of chaos that they experienced with Trump, when he was president, ending his term, and the whole January 6th thing kind of comes flooding back. And I'm not sure that's a particularly good thing for him.
Two important Supreme Court rulings today, Laura, that I want to ask you about. One of them involves purging voter rolls in Virginia. The other involves two swing states here that we've been talking about already this hour, Michigan and Wisconsin. The Supreme Court says RFK Jr. will stay on the ballot in those two states, knowing how close the race is. Did the Supreme Court just win this for Kamala Harris?
Well, the Supreme Court did what they should do in that decision, simply because the appeal was made far too late. If RFK Jr. did not want his name on the ballot, then he should have petitioned earlier, or he should have decided not to run. So this has been true in American politics forever and ever. So this is not new. And so the Supreme Court in this instance is reinforcing decades of precedent around election law, and that stability is what we need. In terms of the other case, with respect to purging the voter rolls, that is an overturn of precedent and 2 lower court decisions. And the purging of voter rolls by Republican governors specifically is a tactic that is folded into this same story that Rick was just talking about, where you are essentially saying there's election fraud, particular to illegal immigrants who are not documented in this country. And that's something that has been going on for a long time. And Trump-affiliated groups have been filing lawsuits in swing states for the better part of the last 6 months. So they will continue to do this. And they have seeded this idea of voter fraud without evidence, and in contrast and contrary to what election officials are saying, all to sort of lay the groundwork for the claims, once again, that the election is stolen if they don't win.
Well, Rick, if we consider this Virginia case, what the state argued was that their program where they removed these voters from the rolls was based on information provided to the DMV, where someone had to check a box to indicate they aren't a U.S. citizen. Now, obviously, opponents to this have said that that does leave room for potential error. People who are qualified to vote, maybe became naturalized citizens, could be removed when they shouldn't be. Do you see actual room for error here? Is this decision justified?
Well, that's the biggest problem, is there is always room for error, right? Anytime you systematically merge a file with another file, whether it's voter rolls and DMV data, you're going to have irregularities. Things aren't going to always fit. And that's what happened from what I can tell in this case. I don't think anybody was going after an effort to try and disenfranchise U.S. citizens from their vote. But that's why the law says don't do these kinds of things within 90 days of the election, because you might have problems. And, we keep talking about, purging non-voters, but like if a voter is purged, you are violating their civil rights, and it is against the Constitution that allows them to have a vote. And even though Virginia only had about 16 voters who were disenfranchised by this purge, who are in the process of being put back on the rolls, this was done in Alabama, and they purged 3,200 people, and 2,000 of them were U.S. citizens. So, it's the kind of thing where nobody's laying blame. It's just what happens when you merge lists, and you don't want to do it too late in the process.
All right, Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Laura Fink of Rebel Communications, our political panel today. Thank you so much for joining us. We have more ahead here on Balance of Power. Up next, we're going to take a look at how markets are viewing this election, specifically through the lens of crypto. That's ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
1:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks are struggling to gain traction. Bond traders slightly trimmed bets on future rate cuts after data showed the economy's going strong. As we check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg, the S&P 500 is now down 9 points. NASDAQ down 49 and the Dow up 21 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.25% and the 2-year yield at 4.13%. Super Microcomputers auditor Ernst & Young resigned in the middle of that audit, sending SMCI stock into free fall. Now shares of SMCI are down 34%. Ernst & Young auditors resigned, citing concerns about the company's governance and transparency. Scrutiny had intensified on Supermicro since a former employee alleged earlier this year in court that the company had sought to overstate its revenue. America's housing market got a boost in September. Fresh data showing contract signings to buy a previously owned home registered the largest increase in more than 4 years in September, thanks to lower interest rates and an increase in the number of available homes on the market. An online commerce outlet, Temu, may soon be under investigation by the EU. Sources say the European Commission will open formal proceedings against Temu to probe whether it broke rules against illicit online activities, including the sale of illegal products. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Amy, thank you so much. And thank you for being with us here on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. You can find us on YouTube right now as well. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. We'll save a seat for you here in the studio as we consider the impact or not the election is having on the markets Amy was just talking about. We've had an ongoing conversation with Abigail Doolittle, Bloomberg Markets correspondent, who has been very effective at capturing this moment on Wall Street and the intersection of Washington and Wall Street. The Trump trade, the Harris trade, if there is one. And she's with us now, 6 days out. Abigail, it's great to see you. This is a market obsessed with earnings. Of course, we've got a lot of them today. Google, AMD, Lilly, and so on. Is anyone thinking about the election while they're trading?
Earnings, that is certainly the main story, Joe, and it's interesting volume for the S&P 500 right now, about 20% above, even 25% above the 20-day moving average for the stock volume on that index. So investors very interested, but as Amy was talking about, the S&P 500 barely moving despite those earnings movers beneath the surface. Alphabet up more than 5%, AMD closed down closer to 10%. The surface flat, I would say in a way that may reflect some of the tug of war right before the election. But overall, the markets have been voting on this election for quite some time, given the fact that the S&P 500 year to date up more than 20%. Historically, as you both know, Joe and Kaylee, the S&P 500 stocks tend to do very well in presidential election years, and this year is no exception. Again, into today, that S&P 500 up a very healthy 20%.
Okay, so if stocks are doing okay, there is the question about the bond market as well, which has been whipsawed by a multitude of things, including the outlook for monetary policy. But can we say in the bond market now, Abigail, it's more about fiscal policy than monetary at this point?
So that's a great question, Kaylee, because in terms of the stock market, if we were to break it down a little bit more in terms of that 20% gain, it's certainly leaning toward the former president, Donald Trump, with DJT up about 300% in recent weeks. We also have the Trump predicted higher than the Harris predicted. But relative to the bond market, because the expectation, and this according to Steve Sosnick over at Interactive Brokers, that his fiscal policy could be super loose and it could mean problems for the budget, that yields could go higher. If that continues, because when yields go higher, that means liquidity is coming out of the system, that could actually in turn pressure stocks. So we're keeping a very close eye on the bond market for sure. Those yields backing up in just the last couple of weeks, a very big amount by 50 to 60 basis points, depending on what yield, what bond, what note you're looking at.
We see the VIX sitting at just about 20 here, up almost 4%. Kind of interesting to consider the potential for volatility around what happens next week, Abigail. And then there's crypto. Wall Street seems to think they have this figured out, don't they?
You know, it's interesting. So that VIX has really been a great tell that the three of us have been watching since July. The VIX curve months and months ago around in 18 when the VIX itself had been at 15. So volatility back then at the time very low, but around the election high, and right now it's high. So investors a little bit wary in terms of what the result could be. Would it be, will it be Harris or Trump? And some are saying that if VP Harris is to win, that could be a near-term negative for stocks because she may not be so friendly to taxes, especially around capital gains. There could be some profit taking. But to your point on crypto, it's very interesting. Right now, Bitcoin trading above $70,000 per Bitcoin. The possible Trump administration considered to be crypto friendly. So that might be another way of markets weighing in on saying that they are voting for Donald Trump. But of course, that is, we don't know that that's the case. But markets right now, right across the board, seem to be leaning a little bit red, at least for the White House.
Yeah. All right, Bloomberg Markets correspondent Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much. As Abigail points to what we're seeing in crypto and the notion that Donald Trump would be better for Bitcoin and other digital assets. At least one person would disagree with that. Democratic Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina, who was a leader of crypto for Harris Zoom calls early in her candidacy and sits on the Financial Services Committee, had this to say on Bloomberg Crypto yesterday.
Kamala Harris's position of protecting U.S. consumers, keeping digital innovation in the U.S., puts her squarely in line with the 71 Democrats, including myself, who supported Fit 21. So I think we've got a really good forward-looking approach by Vice President Harris. And if I can just say one thing about our opponent in this race, there's only one candidate running for president who's called crypto a scam, and that's Donald Trump, who did nothing on this issue for 4 years.
So we want to dig more into the issue of crypto and specifically how it is shaping voter sentiment with 6 days to go until Election Day. We've got some new data out from Paradigm, and their VP of Regulatory Affairs, Justin Slaughter, is joining us now in our Washington, D.C. studio. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio, Justin.
Good to be back here, Kaylee.
Thanks for being with us, and thank you for this data, which is incredibly insightful in terms of what it finds. You find 5% of all voters describe themselves as single-issue crypto voters. Yep. What does the actual breakdown of that 5% look like?
Great question. So to be clear, there's been a lot of discussion over the last few months about whether or not the significant amount of people who own crypto in America, and we have it as 20% of all registered and likely voters, have bought crypto, along with other polls. And it's not clear whether or not they will vote on that purchase. So we asked those who bought crypto in the past, do you consider yourself a single-issue crypto voter? And I'll read the wording exactly because it matters for polling. Do you consider yourself a single-issue crypto voter and that government policy on crypto is the most important policy you consider when selecting a candidate for office? And a quarter of those who bought crypto, 5% of all likely voters, say yes, they are. This was a surprisingly large number in our view, especially given how close this election is. I mean, we're looking at 1% margins in all the key states.
How about when it comes down to Trump versus Harris? Both have tried to seize on this. We could probably argue Donald Trump a little more aggressively, even getting into the family business to some extent. But Harris has tried to make clear her openness to new ideas, to enhancing growth in crypto. But the industry seems to favor Trump. What did you learn?
It was surprising because we're looking not at the industry, but at voters. And among crypto purchasers, it's tied 47-47. This is better for Trump than in the overall ballot, which we have as 48-46. But Harris has improved dramatically from where Biden was in March. When we asked this question in March, asking who do you favor, Biden or Trump, 48% of crypto purchasers favored Trump, only 39% favored Biden, even though this was a population that voted more for Biden than Trump in 2020.
Well, favoring is one thing, trusting is another. And I did notice in your data, Republicans and Donald Trump are trusted more to promote the kind of growth and regulatory nature of the crypto environment moving forward.
Exactly right. And that also is a change from March. In March, it was tied. 25% said Republicans were better, 25% said Democrats. But now in the wake of obviously a lot of statements, Donald Trump said he wanted a Bitcoin sovereign wealth fund. He's doing a DeFi protocol. 30% of voters say they trust Republicans more on crypto policy. Only 25% trust Democrats more. But this is still a jump ball. Independents are much more mixed at about 10% trusting each side. So there's ways to come back.
We just heard from Wiley Nickel, who has embraced crypto in a way that a lot of lawmakers have not. But he has a vision, as he's told us, even beyond his tenure in the House, of lawmakers finding some critical mass here, finding common ground, maybe mainstreaming of crypto with so many lawmakers kind of catching up to the narrative here. Do you see that in the next term, regardless of who the president is?
I actually do, because we also asked all voters, do you consider that crypto will be a major part of the economy going forward or a passing fad? And 46% of all likely voters said they consider it a major part of the economy, along with 47% of independent voters. And remember, only 20% of voters have bought crypto. So a lot of people who haven't even bought into it yet see it as a major part of the economy. And obviously, as Congressman Nickel would tell you, elected officials and policymakers follow the voters. The voters in a democracy are always our North Star.
So no matter who ultimately wins, not the presidency, but majorities in the House and Senate, do you think actual crypto market structure legislation delineating SEC CFTC authority will pass in the next Congress?
I definitely think it'll be considered. The $64,000 question in D.C., of course, whether it'll pass. It should pass. I would think there's a desire for it to pass. But it does seem like we finally have an appreciation in a lot of D.C. that this is here to stay and this needs to be well regulated. And ultimately, right, that is what both candidates are saying. They want America to dominate the blockchain, in the words of Kamala Harris, to control Bitcoin, in the words of Donald Trump. So there is a consensus, I think, burgeoning that we need to be getting up to speed with other countries on crypto.
So we don't necessarily need a Republican Congress to make that happen?
I don't think we do. It's worth noting, right, that I think no matter what, it's likely you could see gridlock or something akin to it. We have a Republican House this Congress, of course, and it often had issues governing itself. This is a topic, to Congressman Nichols' point, 71 Democrats voted for FIT 21, which is a high amount. You could see a bipartisan Rose Garden signing ceremony for crypto legislation, which is not something you can say about most topics next year.
Well, and it does remind us that legislation is what ultimately could change a lot of things for the industry. But the way the president could change things, aside from expressing openness, is appointing regulators, right, at the CFTC and the SEC. Obviously, we can assume with Donald Trump that's going to look a lot different. What about with Kamala Harris?
It's an open question. It's definitely the case that the president has a lot of power to move around commissioners at any time, right? A chairman serves the pleasure of the president. She could say she wants to name a current acting commissioner the chair. She could nominate someone else as commissioner and name that person chair. And then in general, right, I think part of how we got here is the Biden admin has been, shall we say, sclerotic, shambolic in terms of its approach to crypto. There is no one central guiding star, and I saw that in person in 21 when I was at the SEC. If you have a President Harris coming in saying, I want to finally have the government sing from one songbook, that should unlock a lot of potential policymaking and hopefully some clarity.
What will be the residue of this campaign when it comes to the influence of crypto, not just on the presidential level, but some of the Senate races like in Ohio, like in Massachusetts, where we've seen self-funded candidates come out of nowhere and actually make a dent?
I think it definitely shows this issue matters. I think that's the number one thing that was surprising to people in D.C. If you talked to them in early 23, when you said this is going to be a major issue because so many people buy crypto, they said, what are you talking about? Come on, that's not true. And you have to point polling to them, and they still don't really get it. One thing we've seen in our polling that's very notable is that ownership is highest among people who are young, people who are male, people who are non-white, but it's lowest among people who are older, who are white and have post-grad degrees. So in many ways, ownership is disproportionately low among the exact staffing group that exists in Washington, D.C., and that, I think, has caused the blind spot on this topic that does not exist in New York or San Francisco.
But when Joe's asking about the kind of money that has come into some of these races, Fair Shake, for example, there are now crypto PACs with tens of millions of dollars that they've put into this race. Do you expect that kind of money dispensing will exist from this industry in cycles moving forward?
I think the evidence is that crypto is saying it's here to stay and be a player going forward. Obviously, what that means in any given cycle is unclear, but it seems unlikely to expect that crypto will simply walk away. That said, legislation changes everything. You can imagine, things changing as part of a market structure bill. And I think that is, in fact, one of the key questions is what does this industry look like when it is fully part of a well-regulated, clear system where the regulator is working with the industry and on behalf of consumers and investors and not against it.
We were just talking earlier with Abigail about what the markets might do in some of the uncertainty that could follow the election next week. Do you expect a wild ride for Bitcoin, for other coins starting Wednesday morning?
That is so far above my pay grade. And if I knew that, I'd be in a different job. I think what I've learned, so I've been following elections professionally and as an amateur for basically 25 years. There's never been an election where I'm more uncertain of the outcome than this one.
How about that?
It's not just close, it's that the error bars are so wide. It's potentially the case there's a lot of hurting going on. Nate Silver was talking about that.
Yep. Yeah.
So for me, I'm just trying to gird myself for the unknowable, the known unknowns, as it were, in Rumsfeldian talk.
Yeah, it's all gut right now. That's why we have to ask. Justin Slaughter, Paradigm, great to see you, and thank you for bringing the research in this important poll. A really important conversation, Kaylee, as we try to seize on crypto here, along with every other element that brings something to this campaign, hopefully some visibility about where we end up next week.
Yep, and this is your unique lens here at Bloomberg, how the policies we're hearing about on the trail actually could impact markets and regulation. We'll continue to do that on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Let's start, just given what you mentioned, there was some news that came out in the 10Q this morning. It shows that Berkshire sold another 115 million shares of Apple in this last quarter. That's Berkshire's largest holding. And I think in that vein, we'll start with a question from Sherman Lamb. He is a 27-year-old Berkshire Hathaway Class B shareholder from Malaysia. And he asks, last year you mentioned Coca-Cola and American Express being Berkshire's two long-duration partial ownership positions, and you spent some time talking about the virtues of both these wonderful businesses in your recent shareholder letter. I noticed that you have excluded Apple from this group of businesses. Have you or your investment manager's views of the economics of Apple's business or its attractiveness as an investment changed since Berkshire first invested in 2016?
No, but we have sold shares, and I would say that at the end of the year, I would think it extremely likely that Apple is the largest common stock holding we have now. One interesting thing is that Charlie and I looked at common stocks or marketable equities or the things that people love to look at as being businesses. And so when we own a Dairy Queen or we own whatever it may be, we look at that as a business. And when we own Coca-Cola or American Express or Apple, we look at that as a business. Now, we can buy really wonderful companies in the market as businesses. We can't buy all of them. All of their shares. We can't buy 90% or 80% or anything like that. But when we look at Coca-Cola and American Express and Apple, we look at them as businesses. Now, there's differences in tax factors. There's difference in managerial responsibility, a whole bunch of things. But in terms of deploying your money, we always look at every stock as a business, and we have no attempt made to predict markets. We have no attempt made to pick stocks. interested in stocks very early, and I was fascinated by them. And I wasn't wasting my time because I was reading every book possible and everything else. But finally, I picked up a copy of The Intelligent Investor in Lincoln, and there was a few sentences in there that said much more eloquently than I can say it. But if you look at stocks as a business and treat the market as something that doesn't tell you, isn't there to instruct you, but it's there to serve you, you'll do a lot better over time than if you try to take charts and listen to people talk about moving averages and look at the Fed pronouncements and all of that sort of thing. And so that made a lot of sense to me then. And the way I've been allowed to deploy it, Charlie and I talked about this, of course, constantly. It's changed over the years as the amount of capital we have, and the kind of has changed and all of that. But the basic principle was laid out by Ben Graham in that book, which I picked up for a couple of dollars, and which basically said to me, "You've been wasting your time now, but maybe you can use what you've learned or been reading about and put it to better use." And then Charlie came along and told me how to put it to even better use. And that's sort of the story of why we own American Express, which is a wonderful business. We own Coca-Cola, which is a wonderful business. And we own Apple, which is an even better business. And we will own, unless something really extraordinary happens, we will own Apple and American Express and Coca-Cola when Greg takes over this place. It's such a simple approach that it's almost deceptive. Most things, if you keep working harder and harder at it, you learn a little more math, or you learn a little.
Increased at a 2.8% annualized rate after rising 3% in the previous quarter. Consumer spending advancing 3.7%, the most since early 2023. Q3 core PCE coming in just above expectations at 2.2% quarter over quarter. A very important report card ahead of Election Day on Tuesday. We also got U.S. pending home sales seeing their biggest gain in more than 4 years in September. We got Michael McKee with us right now. He's Bloomberg News International Economics and Policy Correspondent. He joins us here in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. Given all the data that we got today, Mike, what's the picture that emerges?
The economy is still in very good shape, still growing strong. Consumers are still spending. Consumer spending was up 3.7%, a very strong number. And this is not what had been forecast by the Fed or private sector forecasters. People thought by this time the economy would be starting to flag, and it's not, at least not from what we can see. Business spending was a little bit weaker than it had been, but there's a shift in the mix to equipment rather than structures, and there's been some thought that the Inflation Reduction Act led people to build factories last year, and this year they're going to start filling them with the equipment to make things. Now, the number would have been stronger, too, if we hadn't had a big rise in imports, which subtracts from GDP, and that is attributed to people trying to bring in a lot of stuff before the port strike that didn't happen happened.
So a clear picture here on the consumer, of course, but you mentioned sports and the strikes, and that's where I want to go. When we look ahead to Friday, of course, the last labor market report that the Fed is going to get their hands on before that decision. And I'm just wondering how noisy the economic data around the labor market is at this point. When you consider the strikes, when you consider the hurricanes, et cetera, you have the weekly data, and then you also have the monthly data to consider.
We're going to really have to wait until Friday to find out, and I say that because we got the ADP numbers today, and while they don't match up directly with private sector jobs in NFP, they do sort of give you the direction and the rough magnitude of what's going on, not always correctly, but enough that you look at it and you see that it did have a hurricane effect in there, about 18,000 jobs lost, and it did have, or rather 18,000 jobs lost, it did have a strike effect in there, and it also had a smaller hurricane effect, but neither was at the level that people are thinking we might see because of those two events in the non-farm payrolls. So we can't say that it will translate directly over, but if we got something in the payrolls report with the kind of disturbance we got in the ADP report, then we wouldn't have a really negative report, probably. Bloomberg Economics thinks we'll lose 150,000 jobs and it'll be a negative 10, but because of those events. But that may not happen. Now, we'll have to wait till 8:30 Friday to see.
Before we get there, we have a lot of people thinking about who they're going to vote for, or maybe a lot of people decided who they're going to vote for. We know that very important to the voter is the economy. And you mentioned, Mike, that things are kind of firing on all cylinders right now. The portrait that we get with today's data and the collection of data that we've gotten in recent months shows that things are pretty good. Gallup out with a survey earlier this month that says that more than half of Americans say they and their family are worse off today than they were 4 years ago. It's a question about feeling, not necessarily about data. Why do you think Americans feel worse off, even if the economy is in a good place?
Well, there are a number of reasons that add up together, probably. One is that housing is just dead. If you want to buy a house, you can't buy a house because the old people aren't moving out of their houses because interest rates, the interest rate they have is so low. There's still a lot of areas of the country that are not growing as fast as others, and a lot of unemployment among older workers and people who live in rural areas. The Biden administration has done a lot through the CHIPS Act and the IRA to build new factories, to bring businesses to these depressed areas, but it's only just getting started. As I mentioned, they just built the factories. They're still, ramping up. It's going to take a couple of years until that happens. And then everybody looks at interest rates. And we don't buy a car very often, but if we are buying anything, we're probably putting it on our credit card, and credit card rates are extremely high. So I think that's where much of that comes from. And it usually takes a while for people to get used to those new levels. Now, we thought we would get a little bit of a boost for the economy and for psychology when the Fed started cutting interest rates and went 50. But so far, the credit card companies have not reacted, and mortgage rates went down for about 2 weeks and then went back up again. So
the bond market went the exact other way. You take a look at what's been happening with bond yields. We're actually higher than where we were before the Fed cut, which is amazing.
Yeah, a lot of people are wondering why that is, and there's a theory that it's because the market is convinced Donald Trump is going to win, and that's going to be inflationary because of his policies. Whether you can attribute that, I mean, the market always wants an excuse or a reason.
Yeah, I need a narrative, Mike.
I'm not sure that holds, but it's probably as good a narrative as any. The other, of course, today we got refunding, and the government is still borrowing a lot of money and says it's going to keep borrowing a lot of money well into next year, and so that worries the market as well.
Let's look forward to next week. Kind of strange, given that we're going to be talking about rates on a Thursday, but that's because of the Fed moving its meeting on one day because of the election.
Is that so that they could have time to vote, like FOMC members?
Essentially, that is correct, because if you're, it's not just the Fed bank presidents who come in from out of town; it's their chief economists and people like that. And in the older days, when you didn't have as easy a voting, they put it off a day so that people could actually vote, and also not to step on the news of the election.
As if there's going to be news that day.
As if there's going to be news that day. Well, that's the question I asked on Surveillance this morning. What do you think? Do you think 8:30 next Friday, or I mean 2 p.m. next Friday, when the Fed has to make a decision, that we will have the name of a president, the next president, or will we still be waiting?
I think we'll still be waiting. What do you think?
Yeah, whether we're going to get the rate decision or the actual president next, I don't know.
I think we get the rate decision first.
You think so?
Yeah, I'll put my stake in the ground now.
What if you're the AP editor? They're the kind of arbiter for everybody, and they're sitting there going, "What if we do it at 2:00 on Thursday?"
Let's front run the Fed here. Yeah, we'll see. Mike McKee, it's great to speak with you. Again, you just think about the next, 8 to 10 days, Tim. It's exhausting to think about.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, Yeah, we'll be here for it.
Yeah.
You're doing a little vacation ahead of that, but you know.
I'm not going to leave this building until I know who the president is.
Okay, fair to say. We'll see if that happens.
Yeah. Don't need to.
Okay.
I'll be running on fumes.
So that's the view of the macro. On the micro side, we've got to check out the worst performer in the S&P 500, and that would be Super Micro Computer. Shares absolutely cratering after Ernst & Young resigned as the auditor, citing concerns about the company's governance and transparency. We got with us Caroline Hyde. She's co-host of Bloomberg Technology on Bloomberg TV, 11 Wall Street time each day. She joins us here in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. Bailey Lipschultz, also with us. He's Bloomberg News Equities reporter. He joins us from our Chicago bureau. Caroline, I want to start with you because I want to remind everyone, or I want you to remind everyone, how we got here today with Super Micro, because it's not the first time that SMCI's accounting practices have been under scrutiny.
No, that was in 2020. In fact, if you look back as to when the last time the shares fell as much as they have today, well, that was back in 2018 when a Business Week report was out that they had seen their motherboards and their servers hacked by the Chinese. They're not unaccustomed to controversy, shall we say. But 2020 was when they actually paid a fine, $17 million penalty to end the investigation of the SEC into concerns about accounting. At that point, it was alleged that they'd been basically seeing their revenue come in faster than actually it had been. Now we fast forward, and now it seems to be that we go back 2 months in August. We get the Hindenburg report that is citing in particular an ex-employee who worries about accounting again. Hindenburg puts out a short report saying that we're worried about the accounting red flags, they call it. The stock tumbles. Then we get a DOJ, reports of a DOJ investigation into all of this. And now, finally, EY not wanting their name to be associated with these financial reports. I mean, that is the last thing you ever want to hear about an accounting firm involved in a company that you have shares in.
Yeah, pretty stunning culmination of that timeline here. Shares currently down about 32% right now. And Bailey Lipschultz, come on in on the fact that Nate Anderson, of course, of Hindenburg Research, he must be having a pretty good day today.
He must be having a good day, Katie. He's having really a good few years, depending what time frame you want to use, whether you go back to the Nikola fraud that he called out or a number of his other big-time hits. When you look at the report from Hindenburg, really kind of laying out those red flags to Caro's point, but the big thing is that was the day before they delayed their 10K filing, so it has been a flurry of issues for the company, and I know this is a name that Hindenburg and a number of other investors, both on the long and short side, have been keeping a close eye on. Again, just given the rapid ascent that we saw over the last few years and what we've seen really play out even back since March when it hit its all-time high.
Bailey, hard to answer a counterfactual here, but Katie and I were kind of talking about this ahead of the interview when we were preparing for this, and the idea that shorts certainly play an important role here, even though they're heavily criticized. Do you think we'd be talking about this, or do you think EY would have resigned today had that Hindenburg report not come out?
I think it's impossible to know, Tim, but when you look at it just chronologically, Hindenburg report comes out the next day. They come back and say, all right, we're going to delay our filings because we need a little bit more time to go through them. Fast forward a month to Caro's point, then you have the reports of the DOJ inquiry and investigation, and now ultimately EY resigning. And you look at the letter that EY wrote, whether or not Hindenburg kick-started this, I think can be debated. But if you look at the kind of outlay and how those events have played out, whether it was a short report or whether this would have eventually gotten out, it does seem, at least on the margin, to point towards Nate Anderson's report actually kickstarting what we've seen play out.
Caroline, remind us where SMCI is in the chip ecosystem here, because whenever I talk about these companies, I feel like I need some sort of whiteboard that shows where they play.
You and me both, friend.
NVIDIA is, TSMC. And
just think of them as encapsulating NVIDIA. They basically take the NVIDIA chips, they circulate them in metal, and they help install your server into your data center. So ultimately, a lot of companies and clients go to a Supermicro rather than directly to an NVIDIA to get all of their compute sorted out. They're in the same lane as Dell, and that is why we're seeing Dell shoot higher today, because main analysts saying that this is their moment to take market share from the likes of Supermicro. And to Bailey's point, this is why it hit an all-time high earlier this year. This is why we saw the shares at one point up fourfold, because they were integral to this whole AI darling surge. And now, well, we're only up about, I think 16% year to date, if you're looking at it. And ultimately, we're starting to see them trying to fight against this narrative. We've got to go and make clear that the company is saying it doesn't expect the issues will lead to a revision in previously issued financials, and they have begun to look for another auditor. But look, the share price tells it all, and if you're looking at certain things, we're down 32%. We're the lowest since January the 18th of 2024, so we basically erased all of this year's gains.
Yeah, big time. And great point on Dell. You take a look at shares right now, up about 7.7%. And Bailey, you think about, of course, this enormous, I'm not going to call it a bubble, but all of this enthusiasm around some of these AI names. Obviously, that's catnip for some of these short sellers. I want to talk a little bit about Lumen, because we're talking about this great year that Nate Anderson is having over at Hindenburg Research. Then you think about Lumen, of course. You had, who was it? It was Kerrisdale who took a short position in Lumen a couple months ago. And Lumen has really defied that. They just signed another partnership today with AWS. The shares have done incredibly over the past couple months. So even if you have some of these big run-ups, I guess it just speaks to how difficult a business short selling is.
Exactly, Katie. But the one thing to keep in mind, and this is kind of the hot debate around short sellers, is we don't know when these activist short sellers actually covered their positions. And we don't know whether they're taking out and betting against the company via put options instead of outright shorting the stock. So it's hard to be able to say whether or not, even with Supermicro in mind, Hindenburg actually maximized their potential return, because for all intents and purposes, they could have covered immediately after, and that would not be disclosed. But to your point, with Lumen, with a company like Symbotic, with all of these other AI flavors, if you will, that have drawn the ire of short sellers, whether they're quiet investors betting against the company or activists who come out with these lengthy reports with a number of allegations, it does speak back to your point, the difficulty for the long-term short sellers to be successful. Because if you go back just a little while ago, you look at a company like Herbalife, that Ackman versus Icon narrative, and how that played out, and you kind of can ascribe that, at least at some level, to a number of these other companies that have drawn the scrutiny of those activists.
Someone's shorting this stock, though. It's 20% of the outside float is currently shorted. So yeah, someone out there is still betting against it heavily.
And they're probably feeling pretty good today. It is a good reminder, though, that who knows, of course, this Hindenburg is still in this stock. But Caroline, when it comes to Supermicro, you know, as you mentioned, this timeline of these sort of accounting questions goes back to at least 2020. What is next for this story? What should we keep an eye on from here? Because, I don't know, you think about the reputational damage that this company is going through right now. It seems like a rocky road ahead.
November 5th. Same day as the election. Is when they're coming out with an updated business report. Okay. So ultimately, it can't be their financials because they're delaying their financials, but they are going to come to the market, to their investors, and give an update on November the 5th. So all eyes on that, all eyes on whether they get another accountant.
Are they trying to bury that news with the election?
Would you dare say such a thing, Katie?
I know.
Let's not forget that this company was added to the S&P 500 this year. Yeah. So, you know, which is a very prestigious thing, and, you know, it gets into
It was delisted previously on its old accounting issues. And actually, that is something that is being brought up again by analysts. I think Woo Jin Ho over Bloomberg Intelligence is saying, look, they need to focus on greater corporate governance. We may require a leadership change. And they're also saying, look, maybe we will start to see an issue of delisting once again.
That's what I'm wondering, if those folks over at S&P are having like second guesses about adding it to the S&P 500.
$19 billion valuation still.
Even after today.
Yeah.
All right, a big thank you to Caroline Hyde and Bailey Lipschultz. Coming up next, less than a week until Election Day, Harris makes her closing pitch. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks are mixed. Bond traders slightly trimmed bets on Fed cuts after data showing the economy going strong. We check the markets all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 is little changed. NASDAQ is down 16 points, and the Dow is up 75 points. The Russell 2000 index is up 10 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.25% and the 2-year yield at 4.14%. Airbus reiterated its goal for 770 aircraft deliveries this year, sticking to the closely watched target despite supply chain glitches. Airbus announced third quarter adjusted earnings that topped estimates. Airbus shares have fallen now 0.4%. The latest read on third quarter GDP came in a little weaker than expected at 2.8%. Economists had expected 2.9%. And in sports, 2 New York Yankees fans who were ejected from Game 4 of the World Series for interfering with play, they've been banned from tonight's Game 5. Dodgers lead that series 3-1. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Tim Stenovec and Katie Greifeld.
Amy, thanks for that update. Do appreciate it. Well, Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris argued a second Donald Trump presidency would be steeped in chaos and division, but not focused on Americans' needs, as she looked to rally voters from the National Mall 1 week before Election Day.
On day one, if elected, Donald Trump would walk into that office with an enemies list. When elected, I will walk in with a to-do list. Full of priorities of what I will get done for the American people. And I will work with everyone, Democrats, Republicans, and independents.
There you have it, Vice President Kamala Harris last night from Washington, D.C. Kayla Gardner was there. She's a Bloomberg News White House correspondent. She joins us now from Washington, D.C. Kayla, I want to start with just the location of this rally for Harris's closing pitch to Americans. Very symbolic, given it was where the former president, Donald Trump, was on January 6th.
Yeah, this was a very strategic decision on the Harris campaign's behalf to really choose the ellipse where Donald Trump gave that speech before rioters went to the Capitol to try to interfere with the certification of the 2020 election. And it was also in front of the White House. And Harris, as you mentioned in that clip, was talking about the Resolute desk, talking about how she believes that she'll be focused on to-do list, really executing on priorities, while she believes that Donald Trump will be focused on revenge and retribution. But really, this speech was overshadowed by comments that Biden made on a campaign call to Voto Latino, where he talked about those comments at the Madison Square Garden rally over the weekend for Donald Trump, where a comedian referred to Puerto Rico as a floating island of garbage. The White House is saying his comments are being taken out of context when he said Trump supporters' comments were garbage. They're saying that was used in the singular and not the plural. But Donald Trump, J.D. Vance have already pounced on those comments, saying that Biden is really dismissing half of the country who supports Donald Trump.
Which is interesting, of course, because this conversation started with Donald Trump's rally this past weekend, Kayla.
Yeah, and I think it's really symbolic of pretty much how Biden has really remained a shadow in Vice President Harris's campaign. Donald Trump continues to try to tie her to what is really an unpopular president, people's frustrations about high prices and inflation, people's frustrations about the border and what she calls a broken immigration system. And just last week, Biden also had this sort of rumbling of words, if you will, where he seemed to refer to President Trump and saying, we got to lock him up, before he quickly corrected himself and said, politically lock him up. So he's had these sort of mistakes that people say these could easily be taken a different way. And these are just things that the campaign cannot afford to do right now when Harris is specifically appealing to undecided voters, people who are considering staying home. So these are things that are really following her at a time in a really crucial period where people are already casting their ballots and deciding whether to vote for her or Donald Trump.
Yeah, more than 50 million Americans have already cast their ballots in many states around the country, Kayla. So what happens now between today and Tuesday? What does the vice president do to try to gain as much as she can ahead of Election Day?
Well, herself and her vice presidential pick, Tim Walz, are going to all 7 battleground states. She's right now in North Carolina, so they're really bringing the same message that we saw yesterday, which she's billing as her closing argument across the country. And I talked to Harris's economic advisor, Brian Dees, yesterday, and he talked about this theme of democracy being very tied to the economy. He believes that Donald Trump would be a risk to democracy and therefore also a risk to the economy, specifically talking about his suggestions that he believes the Federal Reserve should no longer be independent. So they're really trying to make the case that these things are not separate, that they're very much linked. And that has been up to debate. Some people say that democracy is not something that moves voters, that she would be better if she really focused on the economy, on immigration, some of these policy issues that people have really top of mind. And we also talked to Frank Luntz, who is this GOP pollster, and he says that persuadable Republicans are more focused on those policies and that democracy is not as persuadable for them. And these are people that are high income, highly educated, and so they're considering how a Democrat could have an impact on their wallet.
All right, Kayla Gardner, Bloomberg News White House correspondent, with a view from Washington, D.C. and that Harris rally last night. Now let's get a view from the battleground state of Wisconsin, because the Senate race there could determine which party controls the chamber ahead of the expiration of Trump's tax cuts for individuals, small businesses, and large estates. More than $200 million is projected to be spent on advertising in the Wisconsin race, according to Ad Impact data. And Green Bay is where we find Bloomberg News correspondent David Gura, who spoke earlier today to U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin. David, just give all Americans an update on what's happening in Wisconsin, and especially that Senate race.
Just an incredibly close race here. Tammy Baldwin telling me this is the battleground state in the country. She said that her race is a 50-50 race. Presidential race here, 50-50, which she appeared with a few folks running for Congress yesterday, said the same thing about their races. So everything is incredibly tight here, and she acknowledged that. And all the while, you have these two national campaigns acknowledging how incredibly important this is going to be in the presidential race. Donald Trump is going to be here in Green Bay tonight. Kamala Harris is traveling to Wisconsin this afternoon. She's going to appear at a rally with Mumford & Sons in Madison, Wisconsin, a little later tonight as well. So it's a state that's attracting, as you say, a lot of money, a lot of donations from outside the state, a lot of attention. And all the while, folks like Tammy Baldwin, incumbents like Tammy Baldwin, are kind of fighting for their seats in a way that they haven't had to in the past. She's been elected to the Senate twice, and in both of those races, it wasn't a landslide, but she won by a fairly comfortable margin. Safe to say, Tim and Katie, it's not going to be that way for her this time around. And as I went on the campaign trail with her yesterday, tagging along as she took this bus tour, this multi-day bus tour across the state, her message to those who had gathered to see her, volunteers for her campaign, Democrats, union members, was every vote matters here. This is going to be decided precinct by precinct, and if they're able to convert one voter, two voters to voting Democrat in this race, it could have a huge impact on the outcome on November the 5th.
And talk us through some of the hot topics when it comes, of course, to Wisconsin specifically. Of course, she was trying to draw a differentiation between her and her opponent when it comes to taxes, when it comes to health care, for example.
Yeah, let's tick through a few of those. So Tammy Baldwin is really embracing the role that she played in writing the Affordable Care Act. She was in the House then, but she put into that law the provision that allows folks, kids who are up to the age of 26 to stay on their parents' health care. She's mentioning that everywhere she goes. The contrast she's drawing is that Eric Hovde, who's running against her, a businessman, wants to kind of rewrite the Affordable Care Act, really sort of rethink the way that the government's role that the government has in health care. That's one. And we talked about manufacturing, talked about the economy when I sat down with her this morning. Obviously, inflation is front of mind for many voters, and it's something that I asked her about when she and I talked on her bus before she continued on that bus tour today. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
It is certainly top of mind for voters who haven't seen any relief from the inflationary prices that were caused by the pandemic and the screwed up supply chains. You know, those supply chains have been addressed, but the corporations haven't lowered the prices on the products that we have to buy at the grocery store every week. Or, you know, while inflation has gone up over 3 years by 14%, corporate profits at that same time have gone up 75%. My voters who are really squeezed by these prices want a cop on the beat helping them.
So, Katie, what stood out to me from what the senator said there is she's not going quite as far as Vice President Harris is and talking about the illegality of corporate price gouging, but talking about the need for regulatory enforcement agencies to do more, have more cops on the beat, as she put it. So she's trying to evince that she's aware of the fact that folks here in this state are still suffering because of high prices. I should note that her opponent really embracing the fact that folks are suffering and that an alternative could do more. His slogan, which you see on signs all over this state, is restore the American dream. So making that pitch that we've heard from former President Trump that there could be a kind of manufacturing renaissance if he and if Donald Trump were to win, it would bring back a lot of the companies that have either scaled down their footprints in this state or left it entirely.
So talk a little bit about that, David, and the way that the presidential race looms in the background of this Senate race. Because in Pennsylvania, for example, we're seeing Senator Bob Casey actually, in some ads, say he agrees with some of President Trump's policies. Casey, of course, the Democrat incumbent there. So how is it looming in the Wisconsin presidential, or Wisconsin Senate race, excuse me?
We're not seeing the same thing here, and I really pushed her on that this morning. You know, I said that she's acknowledged she's under a great deal of pressure here because the balance of power in the Senate could hinge on whether or not she wins this race. So that's a lot of pressure. How are you dealing with that? Is it moving you to a more moderate position? And she didn't say yes explicitly. I think that she's really embracing the fact that she's on a ticket, on a Democratic ticket in this state. She talked a lot about Vice President Harris, talked about how there's been some fundamental remapping of the districts in this state that are going to make more Democrats have an easier go of running for assembly seats in the state. So she's looking up and down that ticket, and her message over and over again to supporters, Tim, while she's on the campaign trail is vote for the whole Democratic ticket. So I didn't detect her distancing herself as much from Donald Trump from Vice President Harris as you might have seen in Pennsylvania. I look at her opponent, Eric Hofty, who's a businessman who talks a lot about the deficit and has expressed some real reservations about what Donald Trump is pushing for, namely the continuation of those Trump-era tax cuts. He suggested that the deficit is such an important issue to him that it might be a place where he comes to a disagreement should he be elected with Donald Trump. And there could be kind of, as he put it, a robust discussion with Donald Trump if he wins the presidency once again. So you're seeing a bit of a divide there, not so much a divide on the Democratic side.
And David, we only have about a minute left with you, but let's stay down ballot and let's broaden out the conversation because, I mean, we talk to investors all day at Bloomberg News and they're really focused on the rest of the ticket because they're worried about a potential sweep here by either side. It seems like divided government is what Wall Street wants right now. What is the state of play?
It's what I hear from a lot of folks that that's where we're headed. And so I've talked to folks on Wall Street, as you have, Katie, who say the same thing, that that's their expectation, that we're going to see divided government here. I've heard many people suggest that there could be a switch, that perhaps Democrats could lose control of the Senate but gain control of the House. But very few people with whom I've spoken have said that they expect to see a sweep by either party in this election coming up. I hate to say who's to guess. It's anyone's guess going forward here, but something else, the refrain that I've heard over and over again while I've been on the ground here is people just have to be patient in waiting for these election results. I think we're kind of groomed or accustomed to getting those results really quickly on election night. States like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, I think everyone's going to be moving pretty trepidatiously here going forward, looking at those unofficial counts and having to really bide their time and wait for those official counts to come in.
Bloomberg News correspondent David Gura on the ground in Green Bay. David, certainly appreciate your time this afternoon. I think I heard a Harley Davidson go by when he was there. Don't forget.
It sounded like it.
Ticker Hog, based in Wisconsin.
I will never forget that ticker.
Yeah.
Don't you worry.
Based in Wisconsin, so that would kind of be perfect, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Coming up next, we're talking tech, specifically the Mag 7. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Supermicro's computers auditor Ernst & Young resigned in the middle of that audit, sending SMCI stock into free fall. Shares of SMCI now down 32%. Ernst & Young auditors resigned, citing concerns about the company's governance and transparency. The economy expanded at a robust pace in the third quarter that has bond traders trimming their bets on Fed rate cuts, and that's got the markets mixed. We check those markets for you all day long at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 now down almost 3 points. NASDAQ down 13, and the Dow is up 29 points. Russell 2000 is up 8 points. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.26%, and the 2-year yield at 4.15%. Online commerce outlet Temu may soon be under investigation by the EU. Sources say the European Commission will open formal proceedings against Temu, which is run by Chinese-owned PDD Holdings, to probe whether it broke rules against illicit online activities, including the sale of illegal products. And America's housing market got a boost in September. Fresh industry data showing contract signings to buy a previously owned home registered the largest increase in more than 4 years in September. 2 New York Yankees fans who were ejected from Game 4 of the World Series for interfering with play have now been banned from tonight's Game 5. Dodgers lead that series 3-1. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Tim Stenovec and Katie Greifeld.
Hey, Amy, thanks for that. Appreciate it. Katie, have you seen what Alphabet shares are doing today?
I was hoping you'd tell me about them.
Well, they're surging. That's what I'm going to tell you.
Yeah,
The company
Alphabet
reported third quarter results that beat expectations. Cloud computing business is strong. We're going to hear from Microsoft and Meta platforms today. Tomorrow from Apple.
Mm-hmm.
Are you keeping up?
Oh, yeah. No, I am. So I anchor this
companies.
show called Open Interest.
9 o'clock.
Every day, 9 to 11 a.m. So we've been all over big tech. And it's interesting. You think about the narrative from last earnings season. It was all this concern about whether this big CapEx spend on AI was going to pay off. At least in Alphabet's case, it seems like we have some proof that maybe it is.
All right, let's see what Michael Sensatera has to say. He watches all of these companies very closely because he invests in all of them and more. He's Chief Investment Officer and Senior Portfolio Manager at Sylvan Capital Management. They've got about $2.6 billion in assets under management. They've got institutional portfolios, mutual funds, and the Virtus Sylvan Focus Growth Fund has returned more than 21% on average annually over the last 5 years. It's in the 98th percentile of its peers. Michael, welcome back. Big week for you because of Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Meta. They're 4 of the top 5 holdings in your portfolio. NVIDIA is actually the top holding. What's the report card from you so far? There's still more room for these companies to grow?
There is. Things look good so far. The economy's being cooperative, and what we're seeing so far out of the folks that have opened their mouths, mostly at this point just Alphabet, is that most of the growth trajectories are on track. I would say, broadly speaking, AI spend, which has been a big focus of a lot of those companies, appears to not only be happening, but now we're starting to finally see a little bit more evidence of its usefulness. And at the same time, the ad-generated dollars that many of these companies deal with also got some green lights from Google's information last night, or I guess, yeah, this morning. So we're seeing pretty good strength across the board as far as the large cap tech stocks are concerned for the fundamentals that are driving most of those businesses, broadly speaking.
Well, let's talk about what we're going to learn after the bell. Of course, Tim and I will be live for Microsoft and Meta earnings. A lot of scrutiny on Microsoft, especially when it comes to the CapEx. You think about the fact that, they send a lot of money to NVIDIA. They spend a lot of money with NVIDIA, so big focus there. When it comes to Microsoft, which, of course, you own in some of your portfolios, what are you looking for from the investor perspective?
Sure. I would say the most important things at this point are their ability to continue to grow the cloud business, and the more information they can give us around them monetizing AI, the better. From a cloud business perspective, for a long time, it's been a Amazon and Microsoft duopoly as far as the number 1 and number 2 players. And what we saw from Alphabet was finally a little bit better growth than folks had originally thought and planned. And that's a good thing for the space. The question is did they do that at the expense of Microsoft? We don't think they did. We think the space is still growing pretty nicely, and Google did a better job executing. So number 1, we want to see that Azure business at Microsoft beat expectations. We think it will. It had a good quarter last quarter, and that seems to be on track to do so. The second thing we'll be looking for, particularly of Microsoft, is the AI efficiencies. So Copilot has been their primary product that they are now selling seats. So we look for any sort of details we can get around the number of seats, pricing on the seats, and any sort of incremental AI creep into their other products. We expect AI tools that they've been building to start to show up in more and more Microsoft products, and we expect to hear more of the details as these quarters continue. We're hoping for more data tomorrow when we dig through all the stuff, I should say, tonight.
Yeah, you might have a late night, Michael, given that Meta Platforms is also reporting too. When it comes to Meta, what are you looking for there?
Yeah, so Meta is obviously one of the big spenders as well on the AI side, and they have been definitely using their AI tools to drive ROI for their clients from an advertising perspective. So we know that's been happening. We also know that their CapEx budget will be important for companies like NVIDIA, much in the same way Alphabet's and Microsoft's was. So our expectations for Meta is continued ad strength, continued AI leverage, and hopefully we'll get some good CapEx numbers, or at least a thought or discussion around 2025 CapEx numbers from them to give us a sense that the AI trend continues, which we still think it does.
Meta is so interesting. We never talk about the metaverse anymore. It seemed like Meta shareholders are really happy about that. And I feel like that, I don't know, you think about sort of this discipline that was enacted on Meta by the share reaction. I mean, clearly, when it came to CapEx around the metaverse, it seems like traders really didn't want to hear about it. But Meta talks about, spending money more on their AI-focused efforts, and that's been rewarded largely.
Yeah, and I don't think they've actually stopped spending on the metaverse. It's important to note they stopped talking about spending on the metaverse. So I think they still believe that there is a product there, not just a gee whiz technology. And time will tell. Obviously, it's definitely a new way to think about computing and processing. And Apple is partially on board there as well. So they're not alone. But I think the heady days of the more difficult to understand metaverse with NFTs trading and people buying digital real estate, I think that was part and parcel to Wall Street's attitude that this was probably not going to be monetizable anytime soon. So they pulled back perhaps on their discussions around spend on the metaverse. And certainly AI is something that's more tangible, real productivity enhancements, real cost savings, and in some instances, some enlightened, potentially advancement of technology as we do things better. So AI spend conversation sounds a lot better than metaverse spend, but I don't think metaverse spend is going to zero. I think they're going to continue to press there. I think they think it's a long-term prospect that they want to be invested in.
But Michael, when it comes to AI and Meta platforms, for the investor, is it more important for them to think about AI making advertising on Instagram and the family of apps more effective, or to better serve content to people so they stay in the apps longer? Or is it better to think about the new things that they're working on?
Well, I think right now it's the former, right? This is how advertisers get better return on investment. The more that Meta can show any major advertiser that its users are engaged for longer periods of time and more deeply engaged during those periods of time, the more they can charge for those advertising dollars. We know for a long time that the algorithm that you run into on Facebook or Instagram is very tailored specifically to your behavior on your phone. So when you slow down on a post, when you double click through something, when you immediately close something after accidentally opening it, you'll find that the AI algorithms will do a better job of predetermining what you're interested in. And as long as they can continue to sell that at a higher price, which we think they can, that's sort of round one. Round two, sort of the portion of new developments, it's a little bit harder to determine exactly where that'll come from a monetary standpoint. But we know that, a lot of these companies, Alphabet said it last night, productivity is important, right? So if you've got 25% of your code being written by AI, that's a very helpful bottom line cost saver. So you're going to see cost improvements as well. But I think number one, folks want to see the revenue generated. I think that's got more value at this current level.
Michael, got to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us. Always good to check in, especially today. Very timely conversation given we're in the midst of big tech earnings. Michael Sansatera joining us from Sylvan Capital Management.
listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Massar and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. That's Katie Greifeld in for Carol Massar this afternoon. As we mentioned earlier, a slew of economic data today showed that the economy expanded at a robust pace in the third quarter. Inflation-adjusted GDP increased at a 2.8% annualized rate. A big part of that has to do with small business. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce reminding us that small businesses are responsible for employing close to half of the workers in the U.S., and they represent more than 40% of GDP. Needless to say, super important to our economy. For a temperature check of small business, we welcome back Sharon Miller. She's president and co-head of business banking at Bank of America. She joins us from San Antonio. Always good to check in with you, Sharon. You guys do this report over at Bank of America about small business. You get into the demographic details of how small business owners are feeling, how they're doing, what they see coming up ahead. Looking through the data, seems to me people are pretty optimistic right now.
They are. I mean, they did maintain a very positive outlook. I mean, as we surveyed the clients, 78% told us that they expect their revenue to increase over the next 12 months. So to me, that is a good sign. And, there is a positive sentiment out there.
And Sharon, I also thought it was interesting that, within this positive sentiment, you think about what is still an issue, and topics such as inflation, such as supply chain issues come up. And especially with supply chains, we still talk about inflation all the time, but supply chain issues, it's a good reminder that a lot of small business owners are still struggling with that.
They are. I mean, inflation does remain the number one concern in our survey of small business owners. In fact, 9 in 10 told us that they saw inflation as an issue for their business. You're right, supply chain does pop up there, although it has gone down in the list of concerns, but there are still concerns around supply chain. And I'd also say the political environment, that came in number 2, which makes sense. We're in the middle of an election year, and in fact, next week, we will know the election results. And so from there, we normally see this. I mean, we've been doing this survey over 10 years, and every election cycle, there seems to be, concern. And then post that, regardless of who wins, there's certainty and people seem to move on with their business.
So I mentioned that there's really interesting demographic information in this survey. You guys break it down. You look at Black and Latino business owners, you look at women business owners. How do business owners vary based on their demographic data?
Well, I mean, when we talk about women business owners, for example, I mean, they are implementing expansion strategies at a high rate, with 65% focusing on growing their customer base. When you talk about Hispanic Latino business owners, their confidence in the economy despite labor shortages, they're encouraged to obtain funding. In fact, 94% of Hispanic Latino survey respondents told us that they expect to obtain funding for their business to grow. And so, there's some differences, but certainly there's definitely some optimism out there, especially in Hispanic Latino communities and also Black African American communities.
And there's also optimism in local economies. One of the takeaways that I found interesting was that 66% think their local economy will improve, compared to 60% believing that the national economy will improve. Those numbers are fairly close, 66 to 60%, but still an interesting difference there.
It is, and I think, as you think about smaller businesses, and I heard we led into this segment, just thinking about how important small business is to the U.S. economy. But generally speaking, I mean, small businesses are in our local communities. And so, they're very close to their local communities. I think it's important that we support small businesses. And when you think about, what they have more control over, I do think that we tend to see more optimism in local economies and in their own ability to grow their business than maybe that they think about the national or the worldwide landscape.
And Sharon, put some of these numbers into historical context for us. Like you said, you've been doing this survey for about 10 years now. How do the numbers this year compare to the past several years?
Well, we've seen, I think that the revenue expectations, I mean, business owners in general are, more optimistic. And this year we did find a slight uptick as you think about their plans for hiring. In fact, over half plan to hire over the next 12 months, which is an increase. Despite labor shortages, despite finding the right skilled labor, people are still hiring for their business. They are expanding, and those numbers have increased. And so, we have seen an uptick in the optimism of business owners, and I do think that this year's report is really a good sign for the next 12 months to come.
Sharon Miller, President, co-head of business banking at Bank of America, joining us from San Antonio. A lot of optimism coming out of that survey.
A lot of optimism. Yeah, definitely interesting to hear about some of the nitty gritty, especially I really love the point on the local economy versus the national economy. Not a lot of optimism. If you take a look at this market right now,
Really?
the S&P 500 pretty much unchanged
Well,
on the day. There's a real tug of war here.
So
Tim.
you're very glass is half empty on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're at record levels, so I should
Yeah.
probably cheer up. But in any case, you take a look at the points contribution of Alphabet. That is your biggest gainer. On the downside, Eli Lilly. That was a shocking result from Eli Lilly. Basically, that their Mounjaro sales and their Zepbound sales disappointed.
Well, that's kind of a good segue to what we're talking about next. Madison Muller is going to be joining us on Bloomberg Business Week to tell us what went wrong in that report. We also are going to hear from a couple of CEOs, including the co-founder and CEO of Zwift, the Airbus CEO as well. Big tech earnings bonanza. We got it all next on Bloomberg Business Week.
This is CBS News on the Hour, sponsored by O'Reilly Auto Parts.
I'm Cammie McCormick. The presidential campaigning is zeroing in on battleground states, beginning in North Carolina today, where Donald Trump seized on President Biden's comments, appearing to refer to Trump supporters as garbage.
Joe Biden finally said what he and Kamala really think of our supporters. He called them garbage. And they mean it. Even though, without question, my supporters are far higher quality than Crooked Joe or Lying Kamala.
Harris accused Trump of trying to keep Americans divided in Raleigh.
We know who Donald Trump is. This is not someone who is thinking about how to make your life better. This is someone who is unstable, obsessed with revenge, consumed with grievance, and out for unchecked power.
Harris received support today from Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former Republican governor of California. Here's Christopher Cruz.
On X, Arnold Schwarzenegger said a second Trump term would produce no results and would make us angrier and angrier, more divided and more hateful. He said he has plenty of disagreements with Harris's platform, but the only way to move forward as a country is with her as president.
The Supreme Court is allowing Virginia to move forward with its removal of roughly 1,600 alleged non-citizens from the voter rolls. Allison Keyes has that.
The High Court's conservative majority, without giving a rationale, granted an emergency appeal from Virginia's Republican administration, which said the purge was meant to stop people who aren't U.S. citizens from voting. Federal court records indicated that some of the 1,600 voters who were removed are U.S. citizens. A lawyer for the private groups says people can still register to vote on Election Day and cast ballots, and calls the Supreme Court's decision outrageous. Allison Keyes, CBS News, Washington.
The death toll from the catastrophic flooding in Spain has now reached 95. CBS's Chris Livesay has more.
This is the rainy season in Spain. They call it Dana, but it's also a combination of factors. You do have warmer temperatures and warmer atmosphere that's able to hold more water, but that's also combining with a parched earth.
Ever felt frustrated that you can't get your refund from an airline? Here's Chris Van Cleve.
As of this week, flyers are entitled to an automatic refund if their flight is canceled or significantly delayed. What is a significant delay? On a domestic flight, that's 3 hours or more. On an international flight, it's 6 hours.
The Dow is up 30 points. This is CBS News.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week, live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studios, streaming on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals. I'm Tim Stenivek, along with Katie Greifeld of Bloomberg TV and Bloomberg News. She's in for Carol Masser, who's out today and actually for the rest of the week. Katie, what's top of mind for you?
Top of mind for me, of course, really focused on big tech, but I'm also really focused on the other thing that we talk about all the time, and that is GLP-1s.
Ooh, so glad
I
you said
assume
that.
you saw the Eli Lilly
I did.
this morning.
In fact, Madison Muller's in our studio right now. She's going to be speaking to us just a minute.
Yeah.
Tell us about everything that went wrong in today's report. Also, we're going to hear from a couple of CEOs. The co-founder and CEO of Zwift stops by, and then the Airbus CEO going to be speaking a little later, too.
Yeah, pretty interesting, of course. All our focus on Boeing, Airbus should be benefiting from that, some of the turmoil that we're seeing.
The problem is those narrow bodies are sold out to the end
Don't
of the
I know
decade.
it? Just kidding. Anyway.
You love planes.
I do.
You also mentioned big tech earnings bonanza. Microsoft and Meta Platforms reporting after the bell. We will bring you those numbers as soon as they cross. First up, though, check of the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Amy Morris in for Charlie Pellet.
All right, thank you, Tim. And you're right, Supermicro Computer shares are 33% lower now after Ernst & Young resigned while conducting an audit of the company. They cited concerns about the company's governance and transparency. As we check markets for you, we do it all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got red across the screen now. It was green, but now it's red. S&P 500 down 11 points, NASDAQ down 53, and the Dow is down 17. 10-year Treasury yield at 4.27% and the 2-year yield at 4.15%. And as you were just discussing, Eli Lilly has lowered its full-year guidance on lackluster sales of that blockbuster weight loss drug, Zepbound and Mounjaro. The company's shares are about 8% lower at this hour after raising its guidance twice this year. Lilly now expects full-year sales to top out at $46 billion. That cuts about $600 million off the prior upper end of its outlook. And companies added 233,000 jobs in October. Pardon me, that's the most in more than a year, according to private payroll provider ADP, before the government's report comes out on Friday. And the latest read on third quarter GDP came in a little weaker than expected at 2.8%. Economists had expected 2.9%. And in sports, 2 New York Yankees fans who were ejected from Game 4 of the World Series for interfering with play have been banned from tonight's Game 5. Dodgers lead that series 3-1. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Tim Stenivek and Katie Greifeld.
Amy, thanks for that update. Do appreciate it. What would you like to hear about on Bloomberg Radio? Help make shows like ours even better by taking our Bloomberg Audience Survey. Visit youtube.com/Bloomberg Podcasts. Click on the link in our profile or community section to take the survey. It's hosted by our partners over at Material. You can fill it out now at youtube.com/Bloomberg Podcasts.
Yeah.
You mentioned the weight loss drugs, the
I certainly
GLP-1s. Shares of Eli Lilly fell as much as 15% today. This after the company lowered guidance, lackluster sales of its blockbuster weight loss drug. It's a shocking miss for a drug maker, Madison Muller writes, that has been going from strength to strength on seemingly insatiable demand for these drugs. Madison is Bloomberg News Health reporter. She joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. What happened?
I know it's surprising to talk about Lilly when it's bad news. I mean, usually I'm here talking to both of you, or on the, another show with Katie talking about all of the hype around weight loss drugs and around Lilly. And today it was not so good. And it was really surprising to analysts and investors, and honestly to me too. Lilly reported earnings this morning. Their, like you said, blockbuster drug Zepbound missed sales estimates. And they lowered their outlook as a result by about $600 million.
Why, though? Like, we thought we knew that they couldn't keep enough of this stuff on the shelves for people.
Right. And now when they actually can, when their supply problems have gotten better, the sales were lower than expected. Which
is this because of compound pharmacies, DTC, that sort of thing? What's going on?
So that is something that analysts were saying today. Okay, maybe we need to take the compounding threat a little bit more seriously before they had not really thought that it was going to weigh or drag down on Lilly's sales. Lilly is reiterating that compounding is not affecting their business, but today analysts are like, maybe we should actually be looking into this a bit more. Lilly has blamed the sales miss this quarter on inventory issues and dynamics with wholesalers and retailers, basically saying that wholesalers are keeping lower stock of the drugs than they do, or than they have historically with other medications, saying that retailers, aren't adding additional refrigerator capacity to store all of these drugs, so sort of like blaming it on some of the cold supply chain dynamics rather than taking responsibility, which it might not be their fault. We don't really know exactly what's going on, and I think that that's the big question going forward.
It's also, you think about, Tim mentioned it, how much that they've spent on manufacturing. According to Mizuho, reading one of the reports out in the aftermath of this report, apparently Lilly has poured $10 to $15 billion into manufacturing capacity this year alone. Is it possible they overspent there, or is it too soon to say?
It's too soon to say. And that's the interesting thing. We know the demand is there for these drugs. We know that Lilly and Novo are going to be able to sell as much as they can. We're not even, we're just scratching the surface of this potential market. There are so many people with obesity in the U.S. and ex-U.S. Who are not getting these drugs. But there's so many complex dynamics at play with insurance and affordability and access shortages. So it's a question of whether that's playing into things too. It's going to be interesting going forward. And something analysts were saying after the report this morning was this, inventory, stocking, and supply is going to be a big thing to watch now going forward. Lilly's CFO said that he didn't expect this to be an issue going forward, but I don't know if analysts really truly believe that after the big shock today.
What does this mean for Novo Nordisk? We don't hear from that company until next
Wednesday?
Right after the election.
So ADRs of Novo Nordisk fell as much as 4.2% today. They're up now by 0.7%. Does this bode pretty badly for Novo?
That still remains to be seen. There isn't the same level of, I guess, optimism or over enthusiasm about Novo's drugs because they've continued to have supply issues. Wegovy, Zepbound launched in November, December, and the ramp has been extremely, extremely fast. For a drug to do over $1 billion in sales, quarterly sales, when it launched just a few months ago is insane. So I think that the expectations were really high for Zepbound, and they might not be at that same level for Wegovy because it's been on the market for longer. So this may have been just an expectation-setting moment for some of the analysts.
And when it comes to the question of compounds, I'm curious. Obviously this is bad news, or analysts are saying it could be bad news for Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly saying it hasn't affected their business, but who's benefiting from that? Who are behind some of these compounds?
Yeah, so the compounding pharmacies, it's like a specialty pharmacy in the U.S. They're allowed to make drugs during shortages, and bankers estimate that the compounding pharmacies that are making these knockoffs are making $1 billion at least annually, which is a lot, and there's hundreds of thousands of patients potentially taking these. They are a lot easier to access. The shortages aren't the same. They're cheaper. So for patients, that's a huge draw.
Yeah. So I sit next to Matt Miller for 2 hours a day. Is there any drawback to these compounds? He talks all the time about how he's dying to get his hands on some of these GLP-1s. What is their effectiveness versus just the pure stuff?
Right. That is a big question. We don't really know. There aren't the same types of rigorous clinical studies that Lilly and Novo have to do to get their medicines approved, where we can say, oh, Zepbound causes X amount, percent of weight loss. It's just not the same with compounders and telehealth companies. They're not required to do these types of studies. So to say anything about efficacy is kind of not super certain. That being said, HIMSS did release a white paper earlier this week trying to sort of, in lieu of doing these types of studies, estimate the effectiveness and safety of their drugs. They said their drugs are just as safe. They said that they're really effective. People lost on average 9 pounds a month in the first month. But the FDA says that compounders aren't really supposed to make those claims about compounded drugs.
What's the latest data tell us about the efficacy of these drugs when people aren't using them anymore? And to what extent do they have to be on them forever?
I mean, the drug makers would like them, people to be on them forever. And doctors, too, say that obesity is a chronic condition and the drug works when you're taking it. Like, it's not a one-time miracle cure that's going to, cause you to lose weight the rest of your life or to maintain the weight the rest of your life. So these are studies that drug makers are doing right now, but most people regain the weight once they stop taking them.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about the pushback that these drugs have gotten in popular media. It's like, some corners of media at this point.
Who is it, Jillian Michaels?
Yeah, she's definitely pushed back on.
What'd she say?
Well, she's just concerned that people aren't making the right lifestyle changes, I think, that lead
This
to...
is Jillian Michaels of, The Biggest Loser, right?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I always associate her as, a workout
Oh,
person.
no, she had a television show.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't seen that, but...
It's weird.
Thank you, Katie.
I feel like I grew up watching that show.
Yeah, wow, Tim.
Yeah, what can I say? But the idea that we're not making the right life as a country, as a society, we don't eat the right foods, we're not exercising enough, and that should be what we're focused on.
Right.
Not necessarily this idea of attacking it with a shot or a pill.
Right. I think that's because people do say that in certain corners of the world and the weight loss industry, whatever. There's a little bit of a misinterpretation, I think, that these drugs are, because if you talk to obesity doctors, they're like, oh no, it's not just the drugs. You have to take the drugs and make lifestyle choices in order to make this sustainable. It helps with side effects. If you eat healthier foods, you're not as prone to nausea and other side effects. Getting enough movement, enough water. And a lot of people that I've talked to who take these drugs have also, because they feel so much better, made these lifestyle choices sort of on their own. But it's meant to be something that really helps kickstart and get this going for people who are suffering from, a disease that is really out of their control. So I think that there's a misinterpretation that it's either or, it's either dieting or the drugs. But talking to obesity experts, they say it's kind of both.
Madison, we only have about a minute or so left with you, and I want to talk a little bit about what else is in Eli Lilly's pipeline. Because you think back to July, for example, they had the Alzheimer's drug, their Alzheimer's drug approved. I mean, what else is in the pipeline here when it comes to Eli Lilly?
Yeah, so Eli Lilly is actually super diversified, but no one is really talking about anything except for the weight loss drugs right now. Obviously, diabetes is their mainstay. That's their bread and butter. It's, what the company's been doing for 100 years. They also have a neuroscience portfolio with Alzheimer's drugs, like you mentioned, Katie. They're working on non-addictive pain treatments. I think a third of their current portfolio or pipeline is actually genetic medicine. So they have a huge growing presence, hopefully, in gene therapies. They have a gene therapy actually to treat deafness. That's in mid-stage studies. They also have a huge cancer portfolio. They're working on heart disease drugs. So they have a lot going on outside of obesity.
Wants to talk about Zepbound.
Right. I mean, that's the big moneymaker right now. A lot of these things are sort of still in, science research mode, but they have a great breast cancer drug that's, a great drug for them, making them a lot of money too. So.
All right, Madison Moeller, Bloomberg News health reporter, joining us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. I know next week you're going to be very focused on what happens at 1:30 in the morning, Wall Street time, which is Novo Nordisk reporting. I hope you don't have to be awake for that.
No, thankfully not. That will be my colleague Naomi Kresge in Europe.
Okay, good. But we might get you to come back in the studio, depending on what happens. Coming up next, we're speaking with Eric Min, the co-founder and CEO of Zwift.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks are little changed as bond traders slightly trimmed bets on Fed cuts after data showed the economy is going strong. And we're looking at the numbers for you right now. We do it all day here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 now down 9 points. NASDAQ down 44. The Dow is down 14. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.28%. The 2-year yield at 4.16%. The European Union has decided to send officials to Beijing to hold more talks aimed at finding an alternative to tariffs on EVs from China. According to people familiar with the matter who say that agreeing to accept China's invitation to travel to Beijing also could suggest that there may be some momentum in those negotiations. The latest read on third quarter GDP came in a little weaker than expected at 2.8%. Economists were looking for 2.9%. Two New York Yankees fans were ejected from Game 4 of the World Series. They had interfered with play, and now they've been banned from tonight's Game 5. Dodgers lead that series 3-1. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Now back to Bloomberg Business Week with Tim Stenovec and Katie Greifeld.
Thanks so much for that update, Amy. Do appreciate it. Well, full disclosure, people who know me know I ride bikes a lot.
You certainly do.
I'm a big Zwifter, too. Zwift is well known among cyclists as a way to train or compete when it's too cold or rainy to go on your bike outside, or if you want to get a quick workout in. The app connects cyclists riding their bikes inside to real-time races in virtual worlds through a mobile device, a computer, or an Apple TV. Think about it kind of like gaming with your bike. The company's raised $620 million from backers including KKR, Premier Holdings, Amazon's Alexa Fund, and more, giving it a market value of more than $1 billion. We've got with us Eric Min, the co-founder and CEO of Zwift. He joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Welcome. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you back. A lot has happened since you last joined us on Bloomberg. Katie, I don't know if you saw this. We got to do this virtual ride together.
No, I remember it well. It was pretty cool.
Yeah,
I thought you were going to wear the outfit.
I'm not wearing the kit today.
It's disappointing.
Yeah, we're actually,
you got your helmet over there.
I got the helmet here.
Pop that on.
Don't need that for Zwift. But there's a lot has happened. There was a round of layoffs earlier this year, a big hardware pivot. But I think you being back as sole CEO of the company is sort of among the biggest news. Give us an update. How's the business going?
The business is doing really well. I mean, it's doing better than we expected. We've had some change earlier this year, and we've pivoted, and really the focus for the business has been really around what can we do to supercharge our community. I think, which is the most valuable asset that we have. So we are a leaner team, and we're finding that we're moving faster. Of course, we're doing less. But we get to focus on the things that I think will really move the needle for us. So the business is doing great. We launched new hardware this year. It's surprisingly doing very, very well. Over the next few months is really the height of our season.
I do want to explain to people who might not know what Zwift is. When Eric says new hardware, we're talking about an actual bike that Zwift has released. It's called the Zwift Ride Smart Bike. And typically the way that people use Zwift is they hook up their own bike to what's called a virtual, or what's called a trainer, and one that can be hooked up to a virtual world using Bluetooth or another type of connection. So instead of you're still using a trainer with the smart bike, but what's the idea behind a $1,300 bike?
Yeah, I mean, the price point is an important one. It's probably less than half or a third of what you would typically pay for a smart bike. So we've, I think, innovated on price. We've also developed and designed it in a way that you can leverage existing hardware that you've already invested in. So what you have is essentially a bike frame that slides onto a trainer that you probably already purchased. The other piece of innovation that we pushed about a year ago is what we call the Zwift Cog. And, for non-cyclists, it's very complicated to understand, what kind of gears you need to put on these trainers. We got rid of all that with a single cog. And then what we layered on top of that is a little device that can control and create the gears virtually. And, our goal is to, of course, bring down the cost of the hardware to get onto Zwift, but also just to simplify the onboarding experience And that is how we open up the market. All our studies have suggested that those are the two drivers for holding us back from growing even more.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about your business. I assume you make money off of a subscription-based sort of membership there. Where are you when it comes to membership? I think the last time you guys spoke, you said around 1 million members. How has that number changed?
We're over 1 million. I think the pandemic did wonders for us. It also it was a double-edged sword because, you know, of course, like many companies, we thought the growth would continue forever. But what we're finding today is that we're growing. We're certainly growing on a number of different levels, both revenue and subscribers. But I think, you know, to double your business like we did during the pandemic is just an unrealistic expectation. So we've adjusted our business to that.
One thing that you've also done within the last year is actually increase prices, I believe since the first time since 2017. Yeah. So for years it cost about $15 a month. Now it's $20 per month. If not an annual membership, that's a monthly membership. How did members respond? What has churn been like?
Well, you know, I don't think anyone likes price increases, let's be honest, right? But I think certainly we feel very good about it. The value that we offer to our community at $20 a month and $200 for the year is really good value, given, you know, all the other products that are out there and the experiences that we offer. You know, look, things have gotten more expensive since 2017. We've not raised the prices, and I remember reading from community members saying, hey, you should have just increased prices incrementally. I mean, well, we would have actually collected more revenues had we done that, but we felt that the timing was right for us to increase the price, and I think the customers have largely voted with their wallets.
Any more price hikes on the horizon?
Look, you know, I would never say that there will never be future price hikes. I think the $5 move on a relative basis was big. If we do have future price hikes, I think we should do it more incrementally, like I see from Netflix almost every year.
Well, I'd love to talk about, you know, what went into that. Like Tim mentioned, first price hike since 2017. What did that decision tree look like? Because you think about everything that's happened since 2017, it's exhausting, and it's been a really strange economic moment.
Well, we delayed our price increase, and we've done this twice before. Every time we've done a price increase, how we feel about it is like, well, we should have done it much earlier. You know, look, things do get more expensive. Our costs have gone up, and we haven't passed that on to our customers. The product is vastly improved since 2017, so we feel really good about it, and we stand behind it. When we were committed to making that change.
Yeah, that's actually one thing that I haven't talked about. The heads-up display, the worlds. There's been a lot of changes to the gaming environment since I started Zwifting, which was during the pandemic. Personally, I don't see myself. That's the main way I actually ride and get exercise, because I have 2 little kids, and going on a 5-hour bike ride on a Saturday like I used to do.
Your wife isn't into that?
It's just not feasible right now. So Zwift is where I do it. You run a lot, Katie.
I do.
Are you a Strava person?
No.
Okay, that's interesting. She's a Garmin person.
I feel like I killed a line of questioning you were about to go.
That's fine. I'm going to turn this way, and I'll talk to Eric about it. You did. One thing I noticed recently with Strava is an AI sort of integration that they're experimenting with. How are you using AI? You recently launched, for me recently, virtual ride partners, which I find a really helpful thing for me. So this is like a pacer that will kind of go at a specific speed that you can keep up with, and it's really helpful for training and for riding. How are you thinking about AI?
So we already use AI in our engineering development. So that's already been happening. I think in terms of how we can expose these types of technology for consumer-related features, we're absolutely thinking about that, and the 2 obvious places will be the conversational, AI experience that, for example, Strava is doing. And I think that's going to be table stakes for many products. It's not going to be something, so innovative. We have to offer it. And I think the other opportunity for us and others is just using machine learning to figure out exactly what to offer in terms of content and when and with whom. that I think is the next innovation.
That's more like an Instagram timeline approach, where it like serves you what you think you want.
Yes. And I think, it can factor into, your usage behavior, who your friends are, when, what kind of events you like, what kind of fitness you have today, and we can serve up the right content at the right time. I think that is innovation that no one has really, produced yet, but that's an exciting opportunity for us.
What about AI and coaching? I ask because I think about myself. My world revolves around me, and the thing that I miss about college is having a coach. And I was part of a running club, but it was just too much. So I'm sort of like making up my own training plans. I could see a lot of value in having an AI coach be able to see your stats, see what you're doing, and suggest workouts.
Let's face it, if you can afford it, you'd rather have a human coach.
Right.
Because they will motivate you more than any tool that you have in front of you. But I think the two pieces that I just mentioned to you, which is like a conversation about how you did with your workout, and then the AI to tell you exactly what you should recommend next. Those two pieces should, in theory, represent a replacement for an expensive coach. And that, I think, is a solution for, the 95% of the customer base. The 5% should and will continue to invest in human coaches.
$200 to $250, $300 a month
or more,
by the way,
for
enough for a coach. Yeah,
I can't.
For a coach that you've never met and just like puts workouts in Zwift and training.
Also, I mean, I'm not going to the Olympics.
You did go to the Olympics though.
I did. I didn't compete at the Olympics. I'm devastated to say. It feels like a steep bill for my ambitions.
Eric, I'm wondering about competition here because you guys were pretty much the only game in town for a while, with what you did at least. Copy Trainer was around before, but just this week, Training Peaks bought IndieVelo, and now they have Training Peaks Virtual. I remember before I joined Strava, I used Training Peaks, and I quit Training Peaks during the pandemic to go to Zwift, excuse me, not Strava. How are you thinking about competition right now?
Well, we have a lot of competition. It's not surprising, and we've had it all along. I think the Training Peaks and IndieVelo makes absolute sense for Training Peaks. I mean, we are partners with many different training platforms that are out there. We launched something called the Training API, and we've onboarded multiple training apps. So we'll continue to be a platform where coaches and these coaching apps can push activities and activities on where you can actually do the event on Zwift. So that won't change. It'll be really, and I don't know the strategy behind Training Peaks and what they'll do with IndieVelo, but it doesn't really change what we need to focus on. And our focus is really to do everything to continue to add value and features for our community. That's really the important asset that we have.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the future. This is something I love to ask private companies. Are you thinking about IPOing? Would you be open to either acquiring a business or being acquired? What are you thinking about along those lines?
I think we should always look at opportunities to acquire, merge. Those are opportunities that we should be looking at all the time. In terms of what is our end goal in terms of like a liquidity event, I think that just will take some time, but I think we all have aspirations of being a publicly listed company. Whether that happens, in 3 years or 5 years, I don't know. Whether we do that alone or we do it with others, these are all, I think, things time will only tell how that unfolds. But absolutely, our board, my co-founders, my management team, and investors have big aspirations for this business, so that hasn't changed. It's just timing is everything, right?
I mentioned that you raised more than $600 million since inception. Last time you and I spoke, you said you didn't need to raise money in the near future.
Yeah.
How's the cash balance looking right now?
We're very fortunate. We didn't spend all that capital, so we have a pretty strong balance sheet. I don't think we need to raise any more capital. That's helpful, and that gives us
ever.
I just don't. Yeah, ever. Which is great. It gives us a lot of optionality. But, you know, look, having just a lot of cash doesn't help either. We need to deploy it smartly, and we need to think of how we can leverage that to build the business.
Last question. How do you know, the cycling business, there's a ceiling there. There are only so many people who want to be riding bikes in their basement. How do you get people like Katie?
Well, first, you have to get rid of the basement or the garage thing.
Yeah.
And that's why we launched the ride. It's beautiful.
It's my basement,
it's in white. We deliberately picked white instead of black because in our testing, it resonated really well with women.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And I think, you know, we're not just going after cyclists. We're going after people who want to exercise and who want to get fit. And cycling, just the indoor bike and cycling in general happens to be just a great activity. You can do it for a long time. It's low impact. And you have access with your hands, and you can get engaged with an experience like Zwift. So it's not just for cyclists. We hope that the bike really opens up the addressable market for us.
Eric Min, always good to see you.
Yeah, thanks
for
having
stopping
me.
by when you were in New York. Really appreciate it. Eric Min is the co-founder and CEO of Zwift. He joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio.
Thank you.
All right, well, one person who didn't expect to be talking to the CEO of Zwift when she came on our program today is Amanda Ribello. She's head of X-Trackers sales over at U.S. Onshores over at DWS Group. She normally focuses on China, but I found out from Eric that you're actually a Zwifter too.
I'm going to convert Katie.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Maybe sometime.
It's for women as well. It's fantastic. And I definitely had some really wonderful experiences during the pandemic. I was already into cycling. It helped me train for a ride from London to Paris when I was short on time. So, yeah, I am all for it.
That is so cool.
You never know who you're going to meet in the green room
You never know.
at Bloomberg Business Week.
Of the Interactive Broker Studio. You never know.
You never know. Amanda, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in China. You were on with us, or I should say with Carol and Barry at Future Proof back in September. And a lot has changed in terms of how investors are thinking about China, how the Chinese government is using stimulus money or not using stimulus money to stimulate different parts of the economy. What's your view on investing in China right now?
Yeah, it's incredible the tailwinds that we've seen in China over the past couple of weeks. So we've actually been very fortunate to see $1.6 billion worth of AUM go into our Asher ETF. It's kind of a price discovery tool in the market for lack of like a decent future, basically. But what's interesting is that we haven't just seen fast money go into the ETF. Really, it's down to the fact that, you know, I think earlier on in the year, we did see some of the wirehouses, for example, maybe neutralize their bullish tone on China. The Chinese government has been very aware and has continued, you know, over the past decade with things like the Connect program to, while it doesn't really need foreign investment, you know, to try and stimulate that a little bit more. And so in light of the fact that there have been like outflows internationally from Chinese equities, you know, very aware of maybe some of the cynicisms that there have been amongst Western investors in China. We all know that the GDP growth rate had beforehand been 6.5%. That was reduced down to 5%, and there were some concerns about whether the 5% was achievable. So these stimulus measures are very much about confirming to the market that that is feasible. That started off about 3 weeks ago at the, you know, prior to the Golden Week, where we had cuts on the reserve requirement ratio and then also the 7-day repo rate as well. And so what that did was that freed up about 1 trillion yuan of bank capital. What's been really interesting is that that's not just been about corporate lending, for example, or, you know, commercial real estate lending. It's also trickled down to the retail market. And so what you've seen then is that mortgage rates ended up being cut typically by around 50 basis points or so, and that had freed up about 150 billion yuan for the retail investor to ultimately spend. So,
well, let's talk a little bit about China in the context of the U.S. election.
Yes.
Just 6 days away.
The countdown is on.
I know. I've been counting down since like 47 days.
So. Yeah. For some reason, this week just seems really long.
It does.
I don't know if it feels
it's
that way.
only Wednesday.
That's what I told Katie. She said it felt like Friday.
God, it does feel like a long week. Next week is going to feel long as well. And you think about, of course, these two parties, it's pretty, you know, across the aisle, this sort of hawkish tone on China. And from the perspective of the Western investor coming into the Chinese market, I wonder how that factors in.
Yeah, it's super interesting because, especially always in these weeks in the run-up to election, you start to see these kind of dichotomized views, basically. And what's been really interesting about China, you would think, if we were speaking 6 months ago, that, being long China might be a more pro-Harris kind of stance, and then, being short China would be more a pro-Trump stance. But in reality, actually, we've not seen too much wavering in terms of those flows that we've been seeing, which is surprising. Touch wood, that continues over the next few days. But I think that even, Trump came out with this comment about, that she respects him because he knows he's crazy, kind of, right? So either way, it was like a positive tone, really, on China.
His words, not yours.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was thinking about this recently because Elon Musk has turned into this figure in the Republican Party, especially over the last few weeks, giving so much money to the super PAC, doing the sweepstakes in Pennsylvania. Yeah. And he has a unique relationship with China because of Tesla's operations in China.
Yeah.
And I find that sort of adding to the story of him and Trump being kind of strange bedfellows because Elon has to stay on China's good side.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if having him as a voice close to the former president and perhaps future president might be a bullish sign for China.
I think that what Musk kind of understands is that, in the past year, basically, we've seen like sanctions, not just from the US, but also from Europe as well, in terms of Chinese goods. And so Musk likely understands that if China is antagonized, there could be like further sanctions on like selling US EVs into China, which is still a big market, right? We talk about declining population, but it's still over 1 billion, right? It's still 3 times bigger than the US. That's still a lot of consumers that, are a target market. I think then it's perhaps to placate this a little bit. We do have like some conversations with clients about thinking about DMX China. We've been speaking a lot about EMX China. And so we are very aware of the fact that a lot of US equity names, a lot of developed market global equity names have this intrinsic link to revenues from China, to supply chains from China, which Musk is reliant on. And so if you do have this very strong view, Tim, of like, what if the pipe gets cut, right?
Yeah.
Then CRTC is probably our best solution for that.
When it comes to investing in China, though, I think about 2022. And the narrative there was that you were going to have this fantastic reopening in China. It was going to lift their markets, their risk assets. It did not turn out that way. You take a look at what the CSI 300 did in 2022, down nearly 28%, down another 14% in 2023. And when it comes to investors, do they feel burned by that experience? Do they feel shy about that experience? Because you just saw massive inflows into Chinese ETFs that year, and then it took a long time to see the flows start coming in this current episode of optimism.
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair comment. We did see short positions earlier on in the year, but what's been fantastic to see is that actually the CSI 300 year to date is up 15%, and actually from the lows of February, it's up 30%. So we do see that the market is having conviction in the Chinese economy again, at least bringing it back to a neutral position rather than an overweight position.
And just quickly here, we don't have much time left, but I do want to broaden out. I do want to talk a little bit about the bond market because I'm taking a look at your notes. You make the case for high yield bonds. What is the case for high yield bonds?
Yeah, so we know that the FOMC is meeting next week. We will have an anticipation of what's going to happen and the direction of travel. 5%, that kind of 5 handle became like, the norm for us for a little while, right? In terms of yield in portfolios, just from having a cash allocation. And so clearly that's not, reliable anymore. And so what we see with investors on the insurance side, on the pension fund side in particular, where there's liability management to consider, but also within retail, searching for income, is moving down the credit spectrum. And we do actually think that high quality, high yield makes sense, just in light of the fact that you've basically seen a halving of default rates over the last 18 months.
High quality, high yield. It's not an oxymoron, Tim.
Okay, I'll take it.
There you go.
Amanda Ribello, thanks for stopping by.
Thank you for having me.
Good to see you. Amanda's head of X-Trackers Sales, U.S. Onshore over at DWS Group. She joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. T-minus 14 minutes,
Good
more
math.
or less, 13 and a half, depending on when you hear this, until the market closed today, Katie.
Until some big earnings, Tim.
Yeah, earnings bonanza, I think, is how we're thinking about it. We got Microsoft and Meta Platforms, among many other companies, reporting.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what that means for sentiment. You take a look at sentiment right now, not too great. We are hovering near all-time highs, but at least on the S&P 500, currently down about 0.2%. You're having a big day for Alphabet, Amazon up as well, but then you take a look at the downside, and it's Apple, it's Eli Lilly, it's NVIDIA, really weighing on this index.
Well, Airbus reiterated its goal for 770 aircraft deliveries in 2024, sticking to the closely watched target despite supply chain glitches that have weighed on the plane makers' ambitious plans to boost production. Let's go now to Airbus CEO Guillaume Faury, who's with Romain Bostick and Scarlett Fu.
So let's turn now to another stock that we're watching, which is Airbus. The American depository receipts on Europe's largest aeronautics and space company, they're higher after reporting results. Airbus saying it'll stick with the goal to deliver about 770 aircraft this year, really underscoring its focus on ironing out some supply chain glitches that have gotten in the way. We're joined now by Guillaume Faury. He is the CEO of Airbus. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Guillaume. Welcome to Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. I think the big story here with Airbus is that it has struggled to ramp up output. And I know you've spoken a lot about the supply chain being severely degraded. Just give us a sense of what the state of your supply chain looks like right now.
So it's quite similar to what we had by the end of the previous quarter. We are limited by some bottlenecks in the supply chain, which are primarily the engines on the single-aisle family, the A320 family, but also we have issues with seats, with interiors, and to a limited extent, landing gears. Those problems are being managed. So we have difficulties month after month to execute on the ramp-up. We have a quite difficult end of the year ahead of us, the year-end rally, as we call it, as we anticipate to have more than 200 planes to deliver in the last 2 months of the year to reach the around 770, which is the guidance. So that's the environment we're in. It's a difficult one. We deploy a lot of resources of our own teams to our suppliers to be able to help. But when one of our important partners like CFM, GE, is hit by the hurricane, the Milton hurricane in the US, that has repercussion on our own ability to deliver. So that's where we are.
So where do you expect to see meaningful improvements in the supply chain over the next year? I mean, for instance, could we get a resolution on the engines in the A320?
We know that A320 is relying on two engine makers, two engines, the GTF from Pratt and the LEAP engine from CFM. They have different situations to manage. On the Pratt side, there is an ongoing recall campaign that is leading to a lot of planes of our customers being so-called AOGs on the ground because the engines need to be retrofitted. And that's a vast plan that Pratt is managing. They're on their plan. So we believe next year and the year after, we'll see the number of AOGs going down, and we will progressively be able to have more engines for line fit for the delivery of our own planes. And when it comes to CFM, we think it's a more short-term crisis that they have to manage. They're very mobilized and focused. It will continue to impact us later this year, beginning of next year, but it should get much better by the second half of 2025 and hopefully much better later. So these are crises of different nature. We're on it. Our suppliers, CFM and Pratt, are also managing those situations, and we think that's something that is temporary.
So, Guillaume, are you comfortable now, though,